Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Supreme Harry. Presenting to you today, Harry claimed the Merlin-Gryffindor ring and legally banished every member of the Order of Phoenix. Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Vault Beneath Everything. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry had always privately considered the most forgettable day of the week, and perhaps that was the point. He'd been lying on his bed in the smallest bedroom of number 4, Privet Drive, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that he'd memorized so thoroughly he could have drawn it from memory in the dark. Hedwig was out hunting. The house was quiet in that particular Dursley way, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful so much as pressurized. Like everyone inside, it was carefully pretending the others didn't exist. Uncle Vernon had perfected the art of looking directly through Harry at mealtimes. Aunt Petunia had taken to leaving his food on the counter rather than setting a place at the table. Dudley simply left any room Harry entered, which was, honestly, the most comfortable arrangement of the three. It had been 31 days since the Department of Mysteries. Harry knew the count without trying to. Some numbers lodged themselves in your chest whether you wanted them there or not. 31 days since Sirius had fallen through the veil. He didn't let himself think about it for more than a second at a time. That was how he'd survived the first 2 weeks. Strict rationing of grief, the way you'd ration water in a desert. Think about it too long and it swallowed you whole. So he thought about it in flashes, quick and brutal, and then he shoved it back down and stared at the water stain again. The Order's surveillance was constant and suffocating. He could feel it without seeing it, the occasional shimmer at the end of the street that meant a disillusionment charm was wearing thin, the too casual pedestrian who walked the same block 3 times in an hour. They thought they were being subtle. They weren't. Harry had spent 5 years learning to read a room for threats. Reading a street for watchers was the same skill, slightly wider application. They were keeping him safe, they would say. They were keeping him contained was what they were doing, though he doubted any of them had examined the distinction closely enough to notice. Dumbledore's letters had arrived twice. Careful, measured letters full of warmth and absolutely zero information. I know this is a difficult time, Harry. Please stay at Privet Drive. The wards there are your best protection. He hadn't written back to either of them. He'd sat with the parchment and the quill and found that he had nothing to say that wouldn't come out as something he'd regret, so he'd said nothing instead. That was new. The old Harry would have written back immediately, would have begged for information, would have asked about Voldemort and the Order and what happened next. This Harry looked at the letters and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was more like the feeling you got when you finally understood the rules of a game you'd been losing for years, and understood simultaneously that the rules had never been fair to begin with. He was 16 years old. He had watched his godfather die. And the most powerful wizard alive had written him a letter telling him to stay put. So when the second letter arrived, the one that wasn't from Dumbledore, wasn't from any member of the Order, wasn't the familiar red and gold of Hogwarts post but instead a deep, gunmetal grey sealed with wax the color of old gold, Harry sat up so fast he nearly cracked his head on the sloped ceiling. The seal was a dragon eating its own tail. Gringotts. He turned it over. His name was written on the front in angular, precise script that looked less like handwriting and more like something had been engraved there. Harry James Potter, heir presumptive of the ancient and noble house of Potter, care of number 4, Privet Drive. The phrasing was strange. Not Mr. Harry Potter. Not even Harry Potter. Something about heir presumptive made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with attention, the kind of deep, instinctive attention his body reserved for things that actually mattered. He broke the seal. The letter inside was written on material that wasn't quite parchment, it had a faint shimmer to it, like the surface of still water caught in moonlight, and the ink had dried to something that looked almost bronze. He read it twice before the words fully landed. Mr. Potter, you are formally notified that Gringotts Bank has completed an audit of all vaults, accounts, trusts, and ancillary holdings associated with your bloodline as per the Inheritance Verification Act of 1793. This audit has revealed the existence of a sealed vault, Vault 0, which predates the establishment of Gringotts Bank by approximately 4 centuries. Access to this vault is restricted to the confirmed blood heir of the primary depositor. Our records indicate you are the sole living heir. You are requested to present yourself at Gringotts at your earliest convenience. This matter is considered highly time-sensitive. A port key has been enclosed for your use. It will activate at dawn on the date of your choosing and will return you to your current residence by dusk of the same day. This communication has been magically sealed against interception. Ragnarok, Director, Gringotts Bank. Harry read it a third time. Then he looked at the envelope again and shook it gently. A small object fell into his palm, a single bronze coin, old and worn smooth, with the dragon eating its tail on one face and what looked like a compass rose on the other. The port key. He closed his hand around it and lay back on his bed, and for the first time in 31 days, the water stain on the ceiling didn't hold his attention at all. He left on Thursday. He chose Thursday deliberately, not because there was anything significant about Thursday, but because Tuesday had felt too reactive and Wednesday felt too soon. Thursday gave him time to think, which was what everyone always forgot Harry was actually good at when they weren't busy making decisions for him. He packed the night before. Not much, his wand holster strapped to his forearm where it was hidden by his sleeve, a change of clothes, the Gringotts letter folded in his breast pocket. He left everything else. He left his schoolbooks and his photo album and Hedwig's empty cage and the Marauder's map, which he'd considered bringing and then decided he didn't need. He knew where he was going. At 4 in the morning he slipped out of bed, dressed without turning on the light, and moved through the house with the silence he'd learned in year 1 and refined through 5 subsequent years of practice. The stairs knew not to creak under his feet. He was past Dudley's room, past his aunt and uncle's door with its faint snoring rhythm, down the hall, and out the front door in under 2 minutes. The street was dark. The street lamp at the corner threw a pool of amber light that made the surrounding shadows denser by contrast. Harry stood on the front step and breathed the cool pre-dawn air and looked, quite openly, at the spot 20 meters down the pavement where he could see the telltale shimmer of a disillusionment charm that was, as always, not quite as good as its caster believed. He pulled out the bronze coin and held it in his palm. He had considered telling someone. He had sat with that impulse for the better part of Wednesday and examined it carefully, the way you examined a rope bridge before trusting your weight to it. He could have written to Hermione. He could have sent a message to Ron. And both of them would have told someone, not out of malice, not because they were untrustworthy, but because that was how things worked in Harry's world. Information flowed upward. Always upward. To Dumbledore, to the Order, to whoever was deemed responsible enough to handle it. And then the information would be processed by people who believed they knew better, and Harry would receive, in return, another careful, warm, information-free letter telling him to stay put. No. Not this time. He whispered Thursday at the coin, the way the letter had instructed, and felt the familiar horrible sensation of something hooking behind his navel and yanking, and then Privet Drive was gone. He landed on the steps of Gringotts in the grey London pre-dawn, stumbled slightly, and caught himself. The marble steps were cold under his trainers. The bank's bronze doors were closed, but a smaller door set into the left side of the great entrance, a door he'd never noticed in all his previous visits, was slightly ajar, a warm gold light leaking from within. A goblin stood in the doorway. Not the usual Teller-height goblins who staffed the main counters, this one was taller, older, with deep-set eyes the color of aged amber and a face that had the particular weathered quality of something that had survived a very long time by being more patient than everything around it. He wore dark robes without adornment except for a single copper pin at his collar, the dragon eating its tail, same as the seal on Harry's letter. "Mr. Potter," the goblin said. His voice was dry and unhurried, like parchment unrolling. "I am Ragnarok. We have been expecting you." "Good," Harry said, and went inside. The public areas of Gringotts were marble and grandeur and deliberate intimidation, high ceilings, the distant sound of carts on tracks, the rustle and scratch of hundreds of goblin clerks processing the financial affairs of Wizarding Britain. This entrance bypassed all of that. Harry followed Ragnarok through a narrow corridor that descended almost immediately, the walls changing from white marble to dark granite to something older and rougher, stone that had been cut rather than smoothed, lit by wall-mounted torches that burned without smoke. "You said the vault predates the bank," Harry said, as they walked. "By approximately 400 years, Ragnarok confirmed, without breaking stride. Gringotts was established in 1474. Vault 0 was sealed in 1073. Harry did the arithmetic. "That's medieval." "Yes. And no one has accessed it in 953 years, Ragnarok said. "We have not been idle in that time. We have, however, been waiting." "For me specifically?" Ragnarok glanced at him sideways, a brief, assessing look. "For the blood heir. The vault's locking mechanism does not respond to names or intentions. It responds only to blood. Your blood is the first in 9 centuries to carry the correct signature." Harry wanted to ask more questions, but the corridor had opened into something that stopped the words in his throat. It was a chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 15 meters across, with a ceiling high enough to be lost in shadow. The walls were carved with interlocking patterns that Harry recognized vaguely as runes, though they were older than anything he'd studied and more densely layered than anything Hermione had ever shown him in a textbook. They weren't decorative. Each one pulsed very faintly, a deep resonant blue, like the color of a gas flame seen from a distance. In the center of the chamber was a door. Not a vault door in the conventional Gringotts sense, no massive wheel lock, no dragon guardian, no stacked enchantments visible on the surface. This was a wooden door in a stone archway, simple and dark with age, with a single feature at its center, a round depression in the wood, roughly the size of a human hand, with a faint pattern cut into its surface that Harry needed a moment to identify. "A lion. The Gryffindor crest," he said. "In part," Ragnarok said. "The lion is older than Godric Gryffindor. It was his inheritance, not his invention." He stopped at the edge of the chamber and folded his hands. "The door will require your blood. A small amount. Your palm against the impression." Harry looked at the door for a long moment. He was aware of the weight of the chamber around him, the age of it, the sense of compressed time that old places carried, the particular quality of air that had been still for centuries. He was also aware that he wasn't afraid. He identified that absence of fear with some interest, the way you might notice an expected sound that hadn't come. He'd walked into this ancient underground chamber alone at dawn with no one who knew where he was, and what he felt was not fear but something closer to recognition. Like walking into a room you dreamed about. He crossed the chamber and pressed his palm flat against the lion's impression in the door. It was warm. That was the first thing, warmer than wood should be, warmer than anything underground should be, a deep radiating warmth that climbed his arm and settled in his chest like the first swallow of something hot on a winter morning. The runes on the walls brightened from deep blue to gold, and the sound in the chamber shifted, a low resonant hum that Harry felt in his teeth and his sternum and somewhere behind his eyes. Then the door opened. The vault was not what he expected. He'd half imagined the Potter vault, gold coins, stacked high, the comfortable material weight of accumulated family wealth. Or perhaps something like Dumbledore's office, artifacts and curiosities arranged on shelves, each one presumably significant, the visual language of collected power. What he got instead was a single room, stone-walled and torchlit, with a stone table at its center. On the table were 4 things. A ring. A sword, not Gryffindor's sword, which Harry had seen, but something older, the blade darker and less ornate and more plainly used. A book, thick and bound in something that wasn't leather, Harry could tell that much without touching it. And a sealed letter, the wax so old it had gone from red to the deep brown-black of old blood. The ring drew his eye first and kept it. It was gold, not bright gold but the deep, almost reddish gold of something very old and very pure, set with a single stone. The stone was green, though not the bright emerald green of anything decorative. This was a deeper green, the color of deep forest in late afternoon light, and it seemed to shift slightly as he looked at it, like something was moving inside it. The band was engraved with script so fine he had to lean close to read it, and when he did his breath stopped. Merlin Emery's. First and last. By blood and by fire. Merlin's name. Merlin's personal name, the one the histories used when they were being precise. Harry straightened slowly. Merlin, he said. It didn't come out as a question. Ragnar's voice came from the doorway behind him. Merlin Ambrosius, known in his own time as Merlin Emery's. The most powerful wizard in recorded history. The vault was sealed by him personally, in the year 1073, approximately 2 years before his disappearance from the historical record. A pause. The ring was his primary instrument of power. Not a Horcrux, we have tested it thoroughly over the centuries. It is something older and more complex than that. A seat ring, in the old terminology. A declaration of lineage, authority, and magical inheritance. Harry looked at it for another moment. Then he reached out and picked it up. The effect was immediate and overwhelming in the way that only deeply right things are overwhelming, not an explosion, not a lightning bolt, but a sudden, total clarity, the sensation of a frequency you've been slightly missing your whole life suddenly coming in clean and perfect. The ring was warm in his palm, the same deep warmth as the door, and the green stone pulsed once, twice, and then settled into a steady slow light that was less illumination and more presence. He slid it onto his right hand, middle finger, and it sized itself without prompting, fitting his finger as though it had been made for it and had simply been waiting. The runes on the walls of the outer chamber, which he could see through the open door, flared gold so bright they were briefly painful to look at, and then faded back to their steady blue. From somewhere deeper in the bank came a sound Harry couldn't identify, not an alarm, not quite, more like a deep resonant bell that rang once and was absorbed by the stone around it. That, Ragnar said quietly from the doorway, is the bank acknowledging the transfer of the seat. What does that mean? Harry said. Practically. It means, Ragnar said, and there was something in his voice Harry hadn't heard from a goblin before, something that might, in a human, have been called respect, though it sat differently on goblin features, more like the acknowledgement of a proper natural order being restored, that you are now, in the eyes of ancient magical law, the lord of the seat of Merlin-Gryffindor. Which is a legal and magical status that the current Ministry of Magic would very much prefer did not exist, and which they will have absolutely no mechanism to undo. Harry looked at the ring on his finger. The green stone caught the torchlight and held it. Tell me everything, he said. So Ragnar did. They moved from the vault to an upper chamber, still below the bank's main floor, still in the older stone, but furnished with a broad table and chairs that were clearly intended for exactly this kind of conversation. Ragnar poured something into 2 cups that steamed faintly and smelled of iron and herbs and said nothing until Harry had sat down. The seat of Merlin-Gryffindor, Ragnar began, settling across from him with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this explanation, if not for Harry's benefit then for the benefit of the position itself. The 1,000 years of waiting made articulate at last, is not an honorary title. It is not the same as a noble and most ancient house, which is the framework the current Wizengamot operates under. The seat predates that framework by 5 centuries. Its legal standing derives from the Accords of Avalon, the foundational magical agreements that established governance structures for Wizarding Britain before the Ministry existed. The Ministry doesn't acknowledge those, Harry said. The Ministry prefers not to, Ragnar said, and the distinction in his phrasing was precise. Preferring not to acknowledge something and successfully erasing it are different things. The Accords are embedded in the magical foundations of this island. They cannot be repealed by a Ministry vote. They can only be activated or dormant, depending on whether a legitimate seat holder exists. He looked at Harry. For the last 953 years, there has been no seat holder. Now there is. What rights does it give me? Ragnar ticked them off without hesitation. A permanent, non-deniable seat on the Wizengamot. Not a courtesy seat, a founding seat, which carries 3 votes and cannot be suspended, removed, or overruled by the chief warlock acting alone. Sovereignty over all properties and lands associated with the seat, of which there are 14 in Britain and 6 on the continent. Legal authority to issue magical bindings, including, but not limited to, banishment writs, which carry the force of unbreakable magical law once properly filed and sealed. He paused. It also gives you something less codified but equally significant, full emancipation from wizarding minority status, effective immediately and retroactively. From this moment you are, in magical law, a legal adult with full rights and full autonomy. The silence in the room felt different after that. Fuller, somehow. Full autonomy, Harry repeated. No guardian can make legal decisions on your behalf. No institution can claim authority over your person, your property, or your choices without your explicit consent. Anyone who has done so without proper authorization is now, technically, in breach of the Accords. Ragnar's amber eyes were steady on his. I mention this because you may find it relevant. Harry thought about Dumbledore's careful letters. He thought about the Watchers on Privet Drive. He thought about 5 years of being steered and protected and decided for, and the way every decision made on his behalf had been framed as being for his own good, and how he'd never once been given the chance to evaluate whether it actually was. He thought about Sirius, who had spent 12 years in Azkaban for a crime he didn't commit and died before anyone with real power had fought properly for his freedom, and the particular cold clarity that thought produced. The banishment writs, he said. Walk me through them. Ragnar reached into his robe and produced a scroll, real parchment this time, old and thick, which he unrolled on the table. A banishment writ, when issued by a seat holder under the Accords, is a legally binding magical decree. The named individual is restricted from approaching the issuer, their properties, or their person within specified limits. Violation of the writ carries automatic magical consequence, a binding ward that activates on breach. The writ cannot be challenged in the current Gringotts structure because it does not originate in that structure. It predates it. And I can issue them to anyone. To any individual. As many as you choose. They can be issued en masse if the named parties share a common organizational affiliation. Ragnar's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved very briefly to the ring on Harry's hand. You would simply specify the organization. Harry sat back in his chair. He turned the ring once on his finger, slow, deliberate, and looked at the table rather than Ragnar, because some thoughts needed a neutral surface to land on. The Order of the Phoenix. He sat with that for a moment. Not with anger, the anger had burned through weeks ago and left something cleaner in its place. He sat with it the way you sit with a decision you've already made but are being careful about, checking the edges of it for anything you'd missed. They had kept Sirius's existence from him for years while Sirius rotted in Azkaban. They had kept the prophecy from him while it shaped every aspect of his life. They had stationed watchers outside his house not to protect him but to ensure he stayed where he was put, and not a single one of them, not one, had asked Harry what he wanted, what he needed, what he thought. They had made their plans in their meetings that Harry wasn't allowed to attend, and they had communicated their decisions to him through careful letters and sympathetic looks and the infuriating, suffocating assumption that they knew better. Dumbledore knew better. Moody knew better. Molly Weasley, who had held him while he cried and cooked him breakfast and loved him with a fierceness that was real and genuine and he didn't doubt for a second, she still, when it came to information, when it came to choices, defaulted to the position that Harry Potter was something to be protected and directed, not someone to be trusted with his own life. He was not angry at any of them. But he was done. Not done with magic, not done with the war. Voldemort existed and people were dying and he wasn't fool enough to pretend that stopped mattering. But done with being managed. Done with the assumption that the people who loved him got to make his decisions for him. Done with waiting in a bedroom staring at a water stain while the people he cared about held meetings he wasn't allowed into. The ring was warm on his finger. I'd like to draft the writs, Harry said. Today. Ragnar nodded once, the way someone nods when they've anticipated an answer but are still required to receive it formally. He reached for a quill and fresh parchment without any further commentary, which Harry appreciated more than he could have said. It took 3 hours. Not because the drafting was complicated, the formal language was standard, and Ragnar guided him through it with efficient precision, but because Harry was thorough. He listed every member of the Order of the Phoenix by name, working from memory, pausing occasionally to consult with Ragnar on specific wording. Dumbledore. McGonagall. Moody. Tonks. Lupin. Shacklebolt. The Weasleys, all of them, and that one sat in his chest with a particular weight that he didn't flinch from, just acknowledged and kept writing. Mundungus Fletcher. Hestia Jones. Emmeline Vance. Every name he could place. The writ, as Ragnar had suggested, also carried a blanket clause. Any individual who had been a member of the Order of the Phoenix at any point since its reformation in 1995 and who had not already been named individually. He made one exception. He stared at Sirius's name on the list for a long time, quill poised above the parchment. Then he put Sirius's name on the list. It was the harder choice precisely because it was the right one. Sirius was dead. The banishment writ would operate differently for a deceased individual. It would seal the estate records, close the legal connection Sirius had maintained as Harry's guardian, and serve as a formal acknowledgement that the guardianship had failed. It was not about punishment. It was about honesty. He signed the writ at the bottom in his own blood. Ragnar produced a small silver instrument for the purpose, a thing like a precise pen with a hollow needle tip, and pressed the Merlin-Gryffindor ring to the wax seal, and the document shimmered once as the magic took. Ragnar held it up and examined it. Whatever he saw satisfied him, because he set it down carefully and said, "It will take until tomorrow morning to engross the final copies and register them with the Accord's archive. I will have them ready for delivery at your instruction." "I'll deliver them myself," Harry said. Ragnar looked at him for a moment. "That is unusual." "Yes," Harry agreed. He spent the rest of the morning going through the other items from the vault. The book, The Foundations, it was simply titled, its contents a mixture of magical theory and legal framework and something that was neither of those things, a personal account in a hand so old it was barely legible, the ink brown with age. He'd need time to work through it properly. The sword he left in the vault for now. It was too large to carry practically and he wasn't ready to examine what having a second sword entailed alongside everything else. The sealed letter from the vault he opened last. It was from Merlin. He knew that before he broke the seal, somehow, the same way he'd known, pressing his palm to the door, that this was right. The letter was written in Middle English, which Harry's ordinary magical education had not covered, and he could make out perhaps one word in 5. He was folding it carefully to take with him when Ragnar cleared his throat. "The bank maintains a translation service for archival texts," Ragnar said. "If you wish." "Please," Harry said. By mid-morning he had a translation in clean modern English, and he sat in the goblins' meeting chamber reading the words of a man who had been dead for almost 1,000 years, and it was strange how much of it landed, how the old words, stripped of their archaic dress, said things that felt less like history and more like a letter from someone who had understood something Harry was only beginning to understand. "To whoever holds this ring," Merlin had written, "I leave not power but clarity. The ring does not grant you strength you do not have. It removes the impediments to strength you have always carried. There is a difference. One is a gift. The other is a restoration. I made many mistakes in my time. The greatest of them was trusting in the goodwill of those who claim to act in my name. Good intentions are not the same as right action. Many terrible things have been done by people who believe themselves to be helping. Protect yourself first. Trust no one who has not earned it. Led not because you were chosen but because you choose. The ring is yours. The choice is always yours." Harry read that last line twice. Then he folded the translation and put it in his pocket alongside the original, and when he emerged from Gringotts into the mid-morning London sunlight, he stood on the steps for a moment and turned his face up toward it. The city was waking up around him. Buses and black cabs and the distant percussion of a city going about its business. Nobody on the Charing Cross road knew or cared that something had shifted this morning, that a vault sealed for almost a millennium had opened, that a ring had found the finger it was waiting for, that a 16-year-old boy had sat in an underground chamber and drafted documents that would, by tomorrow morning, permanently rearrange the legal landscape of his life. He looked at the ring on his hand. The green stone caught the morning sun and held it. Then he held out the bronze portkey coin and thought privet drive, and let it take him home. He landed in the back garden rather than the street. The coin's aim was slightly off, or perhaps it was giving him privacy, and stood in the dewy morning grass among Aunt Petunia's aggressively trimmed rose bushes, and he was aware, with a calm that felt new and strange and entirely his own, that the watchers at the end of the street hadn't seen him leave and hadn't seen him return and were currently standing their perfectly useless guard on a house that contained one less Harry Potter than they believed. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow the Ritz would be ready. He went inside and ate breakfast, making his own, a full one, with eggs and toast and juice, because full autonomy started somewhere and it might as well start with breakfast, and he sat at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet and he ate, and he thought, and he felt the ring warm on his finger like a heartbeat, steady and certain and entirely, undeniably his. When Aunt Petunia came downstairs at 7 and found him calmly eating eggs at her kitchen table, she opened her mouth and then closed it again, apparently unable to identify which of her many objections to raise first. "Morning," Harry said pleasantly, and poured himself more juice. She left the kitchen. He heard her go upstairs and knock on Uncle Vernon's door and begin whispering in the rapid, emphatic way that meant she'd seen something she didn't understand and was transferring the problem immediately. Harry finished his eggs. He thought about the vault. He thought about the ring. He thought about Merlin's letter and the word restoration. He thought about Dumbledore's next careful, warm, information-free letter, which would presumably arrive within the week. He thought, "I won't be here." And then, for the first time in 31 days, he slept, properly, deeply, the sleep of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it, and the water stain on the ceiling held no particular fascination for him at all. Chapter 2, Ancient Rites, Modern Consequences. Harry was back at Gringotts by 8 the next morning. This time he walked through the front doors. The main hall was already busy, the marble floors echoing with footsteps, the long row of goblin tellers processing the early business of wizarding Britain's wealthiest families with the efficient indifference of people who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. Harry crossed the floor without hurrying, and it was interesting, genuinely interesting in a way he filed away to examine later, how different it felt to walk through a public space when you weren't worried about being recognized. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't wearing his hood up or keeping his head down. He walked straight through the hall with the ring on his right hand and his wand on his forearm, and nobody looked at him twice until he reached the private corridor at the back where Ragnarok was already waiting. "The documents are prepared," Ragnarok said, by way of greeting. He turned and walked without ceremony, clearly expecting Harry to follow. Harry followed. The meeting room from yesterday was set differently today. The broad table had been cleared and relaid with several neat stacks of documents, each one sealed with the bronze and gold wax of the Merlin-Gryffindor crest, which was apparently now Harry's crest, a fact he was still in the process of making real in his head. Alongside the stacks of banishment writs was a second, thicker document that hadn't been there yesterday. "What's that?" Harry asked, nodding at it. "The property register," Ragnarok said. "A complete inventory of all holdings, assets, and estates that transfer to your authority under the seat. I thought you would want it." He paused. "You should want it." Harry picked it up. 14 properties in Britain, Ragnarok had said yesterday. He flipped through the register and the number proved accurate, though the reality of it was considerably more striking than the abstraction. There was an estate in the Scottish Highlands, Avalon's Rest, the register called it, which Harry suspected was not the Avalon of myth but was probably the origin point of that myth's British variant, and that was a thought he needed to sit down with properly at some point. A townhouse in London, in a street that didn't appear on any Muggle map. A tower in Cornwall that the register described as structurally sound and magically active, with the supplementary note last inhabited 1891, which raised more questions than it answered. 3 properties in the Lake District. Several on the continent, 2 in France, 1 in what was now Spain, 2 in Italy, and 1 in a location the register described only as the Northern Holding, with coordinates that didn't correspond to any country Harry recognized. He set the register down and looked at Ragnarok. "I'll need someone to manage the properties," he said. "I can't, the bank has maintained them in trust for 9 centuries, Ragnarok said. "We are prepared to continue that arrangement under a formal management contract, if you choose." "The terms would be fair terms," Harry said. "I'll read the contract before I sign it, and I'll negotiate anything I think is wrong, but I'm not approaching this as an adversary." Ragnarok looked at him with that amber-eyed steadiness that Harry was beginning to read as goblin approval, or at least the closest thing to it. "That is an unusually reasonable position for a wizard." "I've had a lot of time to think about what kind of person I want to be," Harry said, which was true and simple and required no elaboration. They spent an hour on the property management contract. Ragnarok proposed, Harry read carefully, and twice he asked questions that made the goblin pause with an expression that might have been surprise. The terms were fair, as it turned out, largely fair from the start, and the 2 adjustments Harry requested were both accepted without significant argument. He signed the contract in ink, ordinary ink. This time, the blood signing was reserved for the Accord's documents, and Ragnarok countersigned in the goblin script, and it was done. "The Wizengamot seat," Harry said, when the contract was set aside. "How do I activate it?" "You have already activated it," Ragnarok said. "The moment the ring was claimed and registered, your seat was established. You will need to formally present yourself to the Wizengamot at some point to make your presence in that chamber legally operative, but your votes exist now whether or not you appear in person. Can someone cast them in my absence?" "With written authorization from you, yes. A proxy vote, sealed with your crest." Ragnarok folded his hands. "I would caution you that your appearance in that chamber will not be a quiet event. The current chief warlock has held effective dominion over the Wizengamot structure for 40 years. A founding seat with 3 votes is disruptive to that arrangement." "I know," Harry said. "I'm counting on it." He spent another hour with Ragnarok going through the finer points of what the seat's authority actually meant in practice, the specific wording of the Accord's provisions, the ways they interfaced with and superseded current ministry law, the handful of precedents Ragnarok had dug out of the bank's legal archive from the last time anyone had invoked Accord's authority, which was in 1792 and had resulted in what the archive described as significant institutional upheaval. Harry listened to all of it with the focused attention he usually reserved for defense lessons, asking precise questions and following every thread to its end. What emerged from the conversation was a clearer picture than he'd had yesterday. The seat of Merlin-Gryffindor was not just a title and some properties. It was a legal position with genuine teeth, the kind of teeth that hadn't been in anyone's mouth for almost a millennium, which meant that the ministry had spent the last several centuries constructing their power structures on the assumption that those teeth didn't exist. The discovery that they did would not be welcomed. "Fudge will fight it," Harry said. "Almost certainly," Ragnarok agreed. "And he will lose, because the legal foundation is not contestable. But losing legally has never prevented a determined minister for magic from causing significant practical difficulty." He looked at Harry steadily. "You should anticipate a campaign of obstruction, procedural delay, and possibly an attempt to manufacture a legal challenge in the Wizengamot itself." "I'm anticipating it," Harry said. "Good." Ragnarok stood, which Harry had noticed was his way of signaling that a particular conversation was complete. "The writs are ready. All 43 copies, sealed and registered with the Accord's archive. The archive registration means they are operative regardless of whether they are physically delivered, the magic is already established. Physical delivery is a matter of courtesy and clarity. It's a matter of letting people know," Harry said. "So they can't pretend later that they didn't understand what happened." "Yes," Ragnarok said simply. "Exactly that." Harry gathered the writs. There were 43 of them and they made a substantial package, which Ragnarok had arranged in a flat leather case that closed with the Merlin-Gryffindor seal. He took the case and turned it once in his hands, feeling the solid reality of it, and then he looked at Ragnarok. "Thank you," he said. Not just for the documents. For explaining things. For treating this as if I'm capable of understanding my own affairs. Ragnar held his gaze for a moment. You are not what I expected, the goblin said at last. What did you expect? Someone who would ask us to handle everything on his behalf and sign whatever we put in front of him. A pause. It happens more often than you might think. Harry thought about Dumbledore's offices and Dumbledore's decisions and the long careful management of Harry Potter's life, and said, I can imagine. He left Gringotts at 10:30 with a leather case under his arm and the ring warm on his finger, and stood on the steps in the London morning and considered his options. The writs could be delivered all at once or in sequence. He'd thought about this on the walk over, the tactical dimension of it, because he was, whether people acknowledged it or not, actually good at tactics when someone wasn't busy obscuring the situation from him. All at once meant nobody had warning time, but it also meant a fragmented response, everyone reacting individually rather than coordinating. In sequence, starting with the people most likely to immediately take action, meant the early recipients would warn the later ones, but Harry had thought about that too, and decided it wasn't actually a problem. There was nothing any of them could do. That was the point. The writs were already registered. They were already magically operative. Physical delivery was, as Ragnar had said, about clarity. Delivering them to Molly Weasley first and watching her immediately call Dumbledore didn't change the legal fact of what had happened. All it did was start the clock on everyone having to deal with it. He considered his list. Not the full 43, some of them he didn't know well enough to have addresses for, and the blanket clause in the writ would catch them regardless of personal delivery. But the ones that mattered, the ones whose reactions he needed to see, whose understanding of what he'd done had to be unambiguous, he had addresses for all of them. He decided to start with someone who wasn't on the list. The leaky cauldron was quieter mid-morning than it ever was in the evening, which was why Harry chose it. He found a corner booth, ordered tea he didn't particularly want, and pulled out a sheet of parchment and a quill. He wrote 3 letters. The first was to Hermione. It was the hardest to write, not because he didn't know what to say but because he had to be precise. Hermione deserved precision. He told her what he'd found. He told her what he'd done. He told her he wasn't angry, wasn't asking for her approval, and wasn't asking her to choose between him and the order, because that was not what this was. He told her that her name was not on the writ. He told her that if she wanted to talk about it, he would talk, but that he was done with people deciding things on his behalf and that was not a position he was interested in debating. He signed it Harry, not Harry Potter, because she wasn't getting a formal letter, she was getting a message from her friend. The second was to Ron. Shorter, because Ron needed fewer words and more directness. He said the same essential things, more plainly, and he added, I know this is harder for you because it's your family. I'm not asking you to agree with me. But I'm not hiding what I've done, either. You'll understand it or you won't, and I'll deal with whichever one it is. The third letter was not to anyone in the order. It was to Neville Longbottom, and it was brief and friendly and asked if he'd be around in the next few days, because Harry had something he wanted to talk through and he'd found himself thinking, when considering who he wanted at his back for the conversations that were coming, that Neville's name came up before almost anyone else's. He sealed all 3 letters and paid for his tea and found an owl post office 2 streets over, and sent them, and felt something settle in his chest as he watched the owls bank away into the London sky. Then he went to the Burrow. He operated to the lane outside. He'd been able to do this since 5th year though he'd technically never passed his test, a fact that the Accord's emancipation provision had now rendered irrelevant, and stood for a moment looking at the house. The Burrow was the most architecturally improbable building he'd ever seen, the kind of place that made structural engineers instinctively flinch, all those extra rooms added on in different directions and different decades and different styles, held together by magic and love and the sheer accumulated willpower of a family that was too large for any sensible floor plan. He'd loved this house since the first time he'd seen it. He still loved it, standing in the lane with the leather case under his arm. The love didn't complicate the decision. It had nothing to do with the decision. He walked up the garden path and knocked. Molly Weasley answered the door inside 10 seconds, which meant she'd seen him coming from the kitchen window, which was where she spent most mornings. She was wearing her apron, she was always wearing her apron, mornings at the Burrow, and her expression went through several things in rapid succession: relief, because Harry was here and not at Privet Drive where he was supposed to be; suspicion, because he hadn't announced himself through proper channels; and then something harder to name, a kind of maternal assessment, the look she gave people when she was trying to determine if they were all right. "Harry," she said, warmly but with the careful warmth of someone who was also filing questions. "This is a surprise. Does Dumbledore know you're—" "No," Harry said. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside because she was Molly Weasley and she would always step aside for Harry Potter, whatever else was happening, and he came into the kitchen and the familiar smells of it, bread and herbs and something sweet from whatever she'd been baking, hit him in the chest the way familiar things did, with an ache that was fond and sad and entirely separate from what he'd come to do. He put the leather case on the kitchen table. "Would you sit down?" he said. She sat, slowly, still wearing the apron, her hands folding in her lap in the way they did when she was preparing for news she might not want. Harry remained standing, not because he was trying to dominate the moment, but because sitting felt wrong for what he was about to say. "I need to explain something," he said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Can you do that?" Molly's eyes were steady on his face. She nodded. He told her. Not everything, not the details of the vault or Merlin's letter, but the essential facts. He'd accessed his inheritance. He'd discovered he held a legal standing that predated the ministry. He'd used that standing to establish formal banishment writs against everyone who had been a member of the Order of the Phoenix since its reformation. "Including your family," he said. "Including you." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a garden gnome made some distant complaint and was ignored. Molly's expression was, he watched it, because he owed her that, not what he'd expected. He'd expected anger first, the sharp maternal anger that she deployed when she felt threatened or overridden. He'd expected protestation, the Harry, dear, we're only trying to help. What he got instead was something more complicated, a stillness, and behind the stillness something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. "The writs," Harry said, opening the case and removing the relevant envelopes, "are already registered and operative. I'm not here to threaten you with them. I'm here to give them to you in person because you deserve to have it done in person." He set the envelopes on the table. One for Molly. One for Arthur, which he'd leave with her. One for each of the Weasley children who were Order members, which meant Percy, who had broken with his family over Fudge and who was getting a writ regardless because his allegiances had shifted to a different institution that was equally invested in managing Harry Potter, just for different reasons. Bill. Charlie. Not Ron. Not Ginny. Molly looked at the envelopes. Then she looked at Harry. "You're not afraid of what we'll do," she said slowly. It wasn't a question. "No," Harry said. "Because you think we can't do anything." "Because I know you can't do anything to undo it," he said. "But mostly because I don't think you'll try to." He held her gaze. "I think if you're honest with yourself, really honest, not the version where you justify everything with good intentions, you already know that the way the Order has handled me hasn't been right. You know it. You just haven't said it." The silence stretched. "I love you," Harry said, and his voice was steady because he meant it. "I love your family. I have loved being in this house more than I can tell you. None of that changes. But I am done being managed. I am done being kept safe in ways that amount to being kept contained. And the people who have been doing the containing are going to know that, formally and legally, so it cannot be undone or revised or gently forgotten." Molly Weasley looked at him for a long, full moment. Then she looked at the envelopes on the table. "Harry," she said, quietly. "What happened in the Department of Mysteries wasn't, I know," he said. "I know it wasn't your fault. I know nobody planned for Sirius to die. I know everyone was doing what they thought was right. He paused. But I spent a year being gaslit by Dumbledore and the Ministry while Voldemort was building an army, and nobody told me what was happening, and Sirius is dead in part because I didn't have information I should have had. That is the end result of people deciding I couldn't handle my own life. That's what protecting me actually looks like. Something in Molly's expression cracked. Not dramatically, she didn't cry, didn't argue. Her hands tightened in her lap for a moment and then loosened, and she looked older, briefly, in the way that people look when they encounter a truth that has been waiting for them. The writs, she said finally. What do they prevent us from doing? Contacting me without my initiation. Approaching me, my properties, or my person. Acting in any official capacity as my guardian or protector. He paused. They don't prevent you from being Ron's mother. They don't prevent your family from existing. They're not about punishment, Mrs. Weasley. They're about making it impossible for anyone to override my choices, legally or practically. She picked up the envelope with her name on it and turned it in her hands. The Merlin-Gryffindor seal caught the kitchen light. You grew up, she said, half to herself. I was always grown up, Harry said, not unkindly. You just weren't allowed to see it. He left the burrow 20 minutes later with the kitchen quiet and Molly Weasley sitting at the table still holding her envelope, and he didn't look back because looking back was not part of the plan today. He had more stops to make. Remus Lupin was harder. He found Remus at a rented room above a Muggle pub in Kentish Town. He'd had the address from order correspondence he'd read at Grimmauld Place last year, when he wasn't supposed to be reading it, and knocked, and the door opened and Remus stood there in his worn robes with his tired eyes and his careful, patient expression, and Harry felt the loss of Sirius more acutely in that moment than he had in days. Remus looked at Harry. He looked at the leather case. And then, with the particular quiet perceptiveness that made him the best teacher Harry had ever had, he said, "Come in." The room was small and clean in the sparse way of a man who owned little and used what he owned carefully. 2 chairs by the window. A table with books. Remus didn't offer tea and Harry didn't ask for any, and they sat across from each other in the window chairs while the sounds of the pub below drifted up faintly around them. I need to give you something, Harry said. He reached into the case and produced Remus's writ. Remus took it. He looked at the seal. He didn't open it, he seemed to understand what it was from the seal and the set of Harry's expression, and he turned it once in his hands before setting it on his knee. I see, he said. I don't expect you to be happy about it, Harry said. No, Remus agreed. But I suspect I understand it. He was quiet for a moment. May I ask, is this anger? At us, at the Order specifically, or is it? It's not anger, Harry said. It's clarity. He looked at Remus steadily. You were my father's best friend. You were the best teacher I ever had. You knew Sirius for 30 years and you let 12 of them pass while he was in Azkaban and no one fought hard enough for him. He kept his voice even. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think you know it is, and the reason nobody fought hard enough for Sirius is the same reason nobody has ever fought hard enough for me, because the Order defers to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore is an extraordinarily brilliant man who has spent 40 years making decisions for other people in the name of the greater good. Remus was very still. The greater good doesn't ask your permission, Harry said. That's what makes it dangerous. Harry, I'm not finished. Not harsh, just firm. You could have written to me more. You could have pushed, last year, for me to have real information. You could have told Dumbledore that keeping me ignorant was wrong, and meant it, and kept meaning it until something changed. You didn't. Because the Order is Dumbledore's, and in the Order, Dumbledore's judgment is final. Remus's hands were very still on the arms of his chair. Outside the window a pigeon landed on the ledge and regarded them both with the blank impartiality of birds. I know, Remus said at last, very quietly. I know all of that. I've known it for, he stopped. Started again. There are things I should have done differently. Many things. I told myself it was trust in Albus, in his judgment, in his vision of the whole picture. But that's not entirely honest, is it? Not a question. It was easier. Following Albus is easier then, it's easier than what you're doing right now. I know, Harry said, and the gentleness in his own voice surprised him slightly. Does this mean I can't? Remus stopped again. Set his jaw briefly. Will I see you? In any capacity? If I choose it, Harry said. On my terms. Not the orders. Remus nodded. He looked at the writ in his hands and then at Harry, and there was something in his expression that was grief and something that was respect, and the two were thoroughly tangled together. You look like James, he said, but you're handling this like Lily. Harry stood. I'll take that. It's the highest compliment I know how to give, Remus said simply. He was gone from Kentish Town by noon. The afternoon was for the harder ones, the ones who wouldn't take it quietly. Mad-Eye Moody was at a safe house in Hackney, and Harry found him by the simple expedient of the ring, which, he discovered that morning, had the unexpected side effect of making certain magical protections transparent to him, not visible, not bypassed, but simply legible, the way a text becomes legible when you know the language. The Hackney safe house was concealed under a notice me not, a muggle-repelling charm, and 3 layers of aura-grade wards that Harry walked through without any of them triggering, which said something interesting about the seat's protections that he was saving for Ragnarok's analysis. He knocked on the ordinary-looking door and waited. Moody answered it with his wand already drawn, because Moody answered every door with his wand already drawn, and his magical eye was spinning in its socket doing its rapid security assessment. Harry stood in the doorway with the leather case and the ring visible on his hand and said nothing, waiting for Moody to finish his scan. Potter, Moody said. The wand didn't lower. Moody. Harry looked at the wand. Are you going to put that away? Depends on what you're carrying. Legal documents. The magical eye made one more slow revolution. Then Moody lowered the wand, not put it away, lowered it, because Moody was who he was, and stepped back to let Harry in. The inside of the safe house was Moody in physical form, paranoid and practical and weirdly organized in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with operational efficiency. Chairs that faced the doors. No windows that weren't also potential exits. A table that doubled as a blocking position. Harry handed over the writ and stayed standing. Moody read it. All of it, slowly, which was different from both Molly and Remus who had gone still at the seal. He read the formal language, turned it over, checked the back, and then looked at Harry with the undamaged eye, which was the one Moody used when he was being direct. Accords of Avalon, Moody said. Haven't heard those invoked since 1792, Harry said. I know. How'd you access the seat? The bloodline's been dormant. I know. Gringotts did an audit. Harry kept his voice level. It's real, Moody. The ring is real, the registration is real, the writs are real. I'm not here to debate the legality. Moody looked at the ring. His magical eye fixed on it with the focused attention it gave things that were genuinely extraordinary, not the performative suspicion it gave everything else, and for a moment he was very still. I'll be damned, he said, quietly, and the way he said it wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. Probably, Harry said. Unrelated to this. Something moved in Moody's expression that, in another face, might have been a smile. He folded the writ. You've thought this through, he said. Not a tantrum. Not reactive. No. Dumbledore's going to, I know what Dumbledore's going to do, Harry said. I've also thought about that. Moody studied him for a moment with the kind of assessment that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with years of reading people in high-pressure situations. Then he said, good, in the clipped, final way he had of delivering compliments, which was to make them sound like tactical evaluations. Harry gave him a small nod and left. He saved Dumbledore for last. Not because he was afraid of it, he genuinely wasn't, which was the strangest and most clarifying thing about today, but because Dumbledore deserved the full weight of what Harry had already done. He wanted every other writ delivered before he knocked on the door of whatever location he could find the headmaster in, because he wanted Dumbledore to already know. He wanted the conversation to begin from a position of complete fact, not anticipated negotiation. He found Dumbledore's current address through Ragnarok, who had access to the property records of practically everyone of significance in Wizarding Britain and who had provided it without being asked, which suggested that the bank had anticipated this step. Dumbledore was at Hogwarts, which in summer meant Hogwarts was largely empty. Harry appeared at the gates in the long afternoon light, the castle warm against the blue sky in the way it always was in summer, more beautiful than it had any right to be for a place that had been the site of so much difficulty. He walked up the path without hesitation and the gates opened for him, which was new. The gates had never opened for him before without someone actively letting him in. The ring again. He noted it and kept walking. The castle was quiet in the way of institutions between terms. His footsteps echoed in corridors that were usually crowded with the chaos of 800 students. He passed portraits that tracked him with sudden attention, various historical wizards he didn't recognize murmuring to each other in hushed tones as he passed, which meant either his presence was genuinely unusual or news traveled faster through the portrait network than he'd accounted for. Dumbledore's office door was open. The headmaster was standing at the window when Harry came in, looking out at the grounds, and he turned as Harry entered with the particular unhurried grace he had, the quality of a man who is never surprised, or who has at least had enough practice at managing surprise that it no longer registered on his surface. His expression was warm and careful, and full of that deep, attentive gentleness that had always made Harry feel simultaneously seen and managed. "Harry," he said. "I wondered when you would come. Did you know about the vault?" Harry said, crossing the room. He set the writ on Dumbledore's desk without ceremony. "Before yesterday. Did you know it existed?" A pause. Very brief, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible. But Harry caught it. "I had some awareness that a vault of significance was registered to your bloodline," Dumbledore said carefully. "I was not aware of the specific nature of its contents. But you knew it might be significant. I knew your blood carried exceptional lineage." Dumbledore sat, slowly, which Harry recognized as a gesture of deliberate vulnerability, making himself smaller, less imposing, the body language of a man choosing openness. He was very good at it. "Harry, I want you to know that everything I have done has been in the interest of what's best for me," Harry said. "Yes. I know." He stayed standing. He wasn't going to sit down. "Not today. You are the most brilliant wizard alive. I genuinely believe that. You've fought Voldemort longer than I've been alive and you've saved more lives than I'll ever know. I believe all of that." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "And you have spent 16 years managing my life with the same logic you'd use to manage a strategic asset, and I think you've told yourself it was the same thing as caring about me because the result you wanted was my protection." Dumbledore was very still. "It's not the same thing," Harry said. "And I think, if you're honest, you know that." The office was quiet. The portraits on the walls were absolutely silent, which was so unusual as to be its own kind of statement. Fawkes, on his perch, made no sound. Dumbledore looked at the writ. He picked it up and read it in full, all of it, slowly, with the focus of a man examining something complex, and Harry watched his face and saw things move through it. Not anger. Not, quite, hurt. Something more like a man looking at a map and discovering that a feature he'd always known was there had finally become relevant. "The Accords of Avalon," Dumbledore said quietly. "I had not expected the vault to contain the seat ring." "What had you expected it to contain?" "Documentation. Historical records. Some artifacts of power that would require careful handling." He set the writ down and looked at Harry. "Not the ring itself. Merlin hid that with considerably more thoroughness than I had given him credit for." A pause. "He was always more thorough than people gave him credit for." He left a letter, Harry said. One of the things he said was that he'd made mistakes trusting people who claimed to act in his name. Something in Dumbledore's expression shifted, fractionally, but genuinely. The careful warmth dropped away for a moment, and what was under it was just a very old man sitting with the weight of a very accurate observation. Yes, Dumbledore said. I imagine he did. I'm not here to burn everything down, Harry said. Voldemort still exists. The war still needs to be fought. I'm not walking away from that. He held Dumbledore's gaze. But I am done being your asset. Done being your piece on whatever board you're playing. From here, I fight because I choose to fight. On terms I set. With people I trust. He nodded at the writ. That document doesn't prevent you from going after Voldemort. It prevents you from going after me without my consent. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. His eyes, usually so readable in their warmth and intelligence, were doing something that Harry thought might be grief, or the closest thing to grief that a man got when he realized the error wasn't the plan but the assumption underlying all the plans. You are more ready for this than I gave you credit for, Dumbledore said at last. I know, Harry said simply. He picked up his leather case. There were 3 writs left in it, Tonks, Kingsley Shacklebolt, and a few of the lesser order members he'd arranged courier delivery for. He'd do those tonight. But the important ones, the ones that mattered in the way that things matter when they're about more than law, those were done. He was nearly to the office door when Dumbledore spoke again. Harry. His voice was quiet. Without performance. I am sorry. For what it's worth. For the ways in which I got it wrong. Harry paused. He thought about Sirius. He thought about the prophecy locked away in Dumbledore's knowledge while he grew up in a cupboard. He thought about every carefully managed letter and every meeting he wasn't allowed to attend and every choice that had been made for him by a man whose intentions were genuinely good. I know you are, he said. I know you mean it. He looked back over his shoulder. But that's not the same as it being enough. He left the office. His footsteps echoed back down the empty corridor. The portraits watched him go, silent, and the castle around him hummed with old magic, and the ring on his hand was steady and warm, and he walked out through the gates into the long evening light feeling like something that had been coiled very tightly inside him for 16 years had finally, at last, been allowed to stretch. He operated home from the edge of the Hogwarts wards. He was back at Primore Action's request aborted right the next chapter now. Chapter 3, The writs delivered. The owl arrived at Privet Drive just after 7 in the morning, 2 days after Harry's visit to Hogwarts, and it wasn't Hedwig. It was a ministry owl, the official kind, grey and officious, with a red ribbon around its leg that meant the letter it carried had been registered as formal correspondence. Harry was in the kitchen making toast when it tapped at the window, and he let it in and untied the ribbon and read the letter while his toast went cold. It was from Percy Weasley. Not Percy the ministry functionary, not Percy the loyal fudge aide. The letter was on plain parchment, no official letterhead, written in Percy's cramped, precise hand that Harry had always associated with essays marked in red ink and prefect schedules pinned to common room notice boards. It was 2 paragraphs long. Harry, I received the writ. I understand what it means legally. I want you to know that I am not writing to challenge it. I am writing to say that I think you were right, and that I am sorry for my part in it, which was not the order specifically but the broader machinery of institutional authority that I have been too comfortable serving. I know that may not matter to you. I think it needed to be said regardless. Percy. Harry read it twice, then folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He ate his toast. He was still thinking about Percy's letter an hour later when a second owl arrived, this one Hermione's, a neat little screech owl she'd had since 3rd year that always looked slightly disapproving of its surroundings, Privet Drive apparently being no exception. Hermione's letter was 4 pages. He'd expected no less. She'd written it in the way she wrote everything that mattered to her, thoroughly, from multiple angles, with citations where she had them and careful reasoning where she didn't. She'd clearly gone straight to her library after receiving his letter, because she'd found 3 references to the Accords of Avalon in various magical history texts and quoted from all of them, and her summary of the legal framework was accurate in every particular, which told Harry she'd understood his letter immediately and gone to verify independently rather than simply taking his word for it, which was one of the things he loved about her. The personal part came on the 3rd page, and it was shorter and plainer than the legal analysis. I want to be angry at you for not telling me first. I was, for about an hour, and then I thought about whether I would have tried to talk you out of it, and the honest answer is yes, I probably would have, and then I thought about whether I should have the right to do that, and the honest answer to that is no, I absolutely should not. So instead I'm going to say this, I think you were right. I think the way the Order has handled you has been wrong for a long time, and I didn't say it loudly enough because I was afraid of what it would mean for our access, our information, our position inside the structure. That was cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. I'm sorry. Your name is not on any writ, and I know that was a choice you made deliberately, and I want you to know I understand what it means and I won't waste it. Ron got your letter. He hasn't written back yet. Give him time, this is harder for him, you know why. But Harry, he'll come. He just needs to find a way to carry both things at once. I'll be at my parents' house through the end of July. Write to me. About anything. Including the vault, because I have approximately 40 questions about the magical history implications alone. Hermione. Harry wrote back immediately, 4 lines, good. I knew you'd understand eventually. I have the translation of Merlin's letter if you want to read it. And yes, Ron will come. He always does. He sent the reply and then sat with his 2nd cup of tea and thought about the day. Today was the day he'd set aside for the writs he hadn't personally delivered, the ones that required either courier arrangement through the bank or, in a handful of cases, his own appearance. Tonks he'd arranged through Gringotts. Kingsley Shacklebolt he'd arranged through Gringotts. The remaining minor order members, Hestia Jones, Sturgis Podmore, Daedalus Diggle, he'd also arranged through the bank's legal courier service, sealed and registered. That left 1. He'd been thinking about it since he got back from Hogwarts. He'd been thinking about it with the particular careful attention he gave things that had emotional weight he couldn't afford to let distort his judgment. He'd thought about it through 2 evenings and 1 sleepless stretch of early morning when the argument going on in his chest had gotten loud enough that rest wasn't an option. Bill Weasley. Not because Bill was especially complicated, though he was, in the particular way that the oldest child of a large family was always complicated, carrying the weight of example and expectation. No, Bill was complicated because Bill's writ was the one Harry had to deliver himself, in person, today, at the same time as the writ for Charlie, and the reason both of them needed personal delivery was that both of them were currently staying at the Burrow while Charlie was in England visiting family, and Harry had a reason to go back to the Burrow today that had nothing to do with the writs at all. Ginny. He'd been thinking about that too. He'd been thinking about it with the same careful attention and finding, each time, that the thinking produced a consistent result. Ginny Weasley had not received a writ. Not because she was a Weasley and therefore automatically exempt, Ron was a Weasley and Ron hadn't received one either, though for different reasons, but because Ginny had never been order, had never managed him, had never deferred to Dumbledore's judgment at Harry's expense. What she'd done, across 5 years of school, was be herself with absolute consistency, sharp, funny, clear-eyed, and entirely unimpressed with Harry's fame while being genuinely interested in Harry as a person. He knew what he was going to say to her. He'd known, actually, for a while, in the way you know things that you've been putting off saying because the right moment hadn't quite arrived and also because you were 16 and terrified in all the ways that 16 and terrified express themselves. Today felt like the right moment, though he'd have preferred it not coincide with delivering banishment documents to her brothers. He arrived at the Burrow at 10, same route as before, same garden path, and this time the door was opened by Ginny before he'd finished knocking. She was already looking at him in the particular way she had, direct, without the performance of looking, just actual attention, and he noticed that she was holding a quaffle she'd apparently been practicing with in the garden, and she was wearing jeans and a faded Holyhead Harpies t-shirt, and her hair was in a messy plait. And Harry's brain noted all of this and filed it under important with the same instinct that filed hexes and tactical positioning. "Mum told me you were coming back," she said. "Probably," Harry said. She looked at his hand, at the ring, and her eyes sharpened. "Is that, yes? Can I come in?" She stepped back. He came inside and the Burrows' kitchen was busier than 2 days ago, Molly at the counter, Arthur at the table with the newspaper, and both Bill and Charlie at the far end of the kitchen in that particular arrangement of large, casually powerful men that meant they'd been waiting. Bill was Bill, the long red hair, the earring, the dragon-hide jacket that lived on his shoulders like a second skin. Charlie was broader, more weathered, with the specific quality of someone who had spent years working outside with very large magical creatures and was entirely comfortable with things that other people found alarming. Both of them were looking at Harry with the attentiveness of people who had been briefed. "Bill," Harry said. "Charlie." He set the leather case on the table, less full now, down to the last few contents, and reached in for their envelopes. He slid them across the table without drama. "I imagine your mum explained." Bill picked his up. He examined the seal with the focused eye of a professional cursebreaker who assessed unfamiliar magical objects the way other people assessed furniture, with habitual professional analysis. "She explained," he said. "I also got an owl from Gringotts this morning confirming the Accord's registration." He looked at Harry. "I work for Gringotts, as you know. So I had access to the formal filing." "I know," Harry said. "The seat of Merlin-Gryffindor," Bill said. He was turning the envelope over in his hands. "I thought that bloodline died out in the 1200s. Apparently not." Charlie had opened his envelope and was reading the writ with a calm that might have been professional detachment or might have been the temperament of someone who worked with dragons, in which case a banishment document was comparatively low stakes. He looked up when he'd finished. "This is solid work," he said, with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "Who drafted it?" "Ragnarok." "Right." Charlie nodded as if that explained everything. He folded the writ and put it in his jacket pocket. "For what it's worth, Harry, I think I understand. The order's done you a disservice. I haven't been around enough to have been part of it personally, but I know how it operates, and I know," he glanced at his mother, briefly, with the careful look of a son who loves his mother and is navigating her presence carefully. "I know the instinct is to protect first and ask questions never, and that's not good enough for someone in your position." "Charlie," Molly said, from the counter, in the tone that meant she was not objecting to the substance but to the timing. "It's true, Mum," Charlie said. Simple. No apology. Molly turned back to the counter without responding. Bill was still looking at Harry. Not at the envelope, not at the ring, at Harry specifically, with the evaluating quality of someone who did genuinely complex magical assessment for a living. "The ring," he said. "You've activated it fully? Not just the inheritance claim, the full seat authority?" "Yes." "And the protections are operational?" Harry frowned slightly. "What protections specifically?" Bill exchanged a very brief look with Charlie that Harry caught and logged. The Merlin-Gryffindor seat carried a set of personal protections under the old magic, not just property wards, personal ones. Tied to the blood heir. "If you've fully claimed the seat," he stopped. "You don't know about them yet. Tell me." "They're called the Avalon wards," Bill said, with the tone of a man choosing his words carefully because the subject warranted it. "Old magic, older than almost anything currently practiced. They're tied to the ring itself. Passive protections, not spells you cast but a permanent ambient field around you. Based on what I've read," he glanced at Charlie again. "The last time a full seat holder activated them, curses rebounded, legilimency didn't penetrate, and summoning spells, including certain forms of magical compulsion, didn't function within the holder's radius." Harry turned the ring once on his finger. "That's why Moody's wards didn't trigger when I walked through them," he said, almost to himself. Probably, yes, Bill said. The Avalon wards interact with other magical protections they don't break them, they just classify the holder as outside their parameters. He paused. Harry, what I'm saying is that you may be considerably more difficult to harm than you currently know, and you should probably spend some time with someone who understands old magic before you walk into anything serious. I'll talk to Ragnarok, Harry said. Good. Talk to Ragnarok. Bill looked at the ring one more time and then at Harry's face. And for what it's worth from me, I'm not angry about the writ. I'm angry at myself for not standing up louder inside the order when it mattered. He extended his hand. Harry shook it. Charlie clapped him on the shoulder with the casual affection of someone who expressed things physically rather than verbally, which briefly displaced Harry's center of gravity and was meant warmly. Then they both drifted out of the kitchen with the tact of men who recognized that the room needed to be less full, and Molly went upstairs for some reason that was clearly also tact, and Harry turned and found Ginny leaning in the kitchen doorway where she'd been the whole time, watching everything with those sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. Walk? She said. Yeah, he said. The Burrows' garden in summer was a particular kind of beautiful that had nothing to do with order, it was wild and abundant and slightly chaotic, the garden gnomes conducting their low-level territorial disputes in the far corners, the vegetable patch in its own determined sprawl, the old orchard beyond the fence where the Weasley children had flown their brooms since they were old enough to stay on. Harry and Ginny walked out through the kitchen garden and into the orchard without discussing direction, the same way you went somewhere you'd been before. She waited until they were in the orchard, out of sight of the house windows, before she said anything. Mum cried, she said. After you left, 2 days ago. Not in front of anyone, but I heard her. In the kitchen. I know, Harry said. She's not angry, Ginny said. That's the thing. I think she's ashamed. Which is worse. I'm not trying to punish her. I know you're not. She knows you're not. That's what makes it worse. Ginny stopped walking and turned to face him, and she had the coiffle under one arm still and her hair was coming out of its plait at the edges and she was looking at him with the direct look that he'd realized, somewhere around 4th year, meant she was about to say something true. You know I was never going to be on the list. No, he said. You were never going to be on the list. Because I didn't do the thing. Because you've never treated me like something to be managed, he said. Not once. Not even when everyone around you was doing exactly that. She studied him for a moment. The orchard was quiet around them, the old apple trees throwing dappled shadow, the distant sounds of gnomes and the occasional magical creak of the burrow settling. Is this where you say something that you've been thinking for a while and haven't said because the timing was always wrong? She asked. Harry felt the corners of his mouth move. The timing is still bad, he said. Given what I've just done to your brothers. My brothers can manage themselves, Ginny said flatly. And the timing will always be something. So, Harry said. He looked at her, the real looking, not the sideways kind, and the thing he'd been carrying with careful restraint for roughly a year loosened its grip. I like you. I have liked you for a long time, in a way that has nothing to do with anything except who you actually are. And I'm done waiting for better circumstances. Ginny was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she said, finally, with a feeling that was so comprehensive it covered several acres of unsaid things, and kissed him, and the coiffle fell into the grass and neither of them did anything about it. When they broke apart she was smiling, the real one, not the polished public version, the one that made her whole face different, and Harry found that the ring on his hand and the weight of the case in the house and everything that was coming felt, for this particular moment in this particular orchard, considerably more manageable than it had at any previous point. Ron's going to be weird about this, Ginny observed. Ron's going to be weird about everything for a while, Harry said. He'll adjust. She picked up the coiffle and tucked it back under her arm and they walked back toward the house in the warm late morning light, and Harry thought about Merlin's letter, lead not because you were chosen but because you choose, and found that it applied to considerably more than political authority. He was back at Privet Drive by early afternoon and had been there approximately 40 minutes when the ward at the boundary of the property, a new ward, one of his own, established through the ring the day before when he discovered he could do it by instinct without a wand, which was something else he was saving for Ragnarok's analysis, signaled an approach. He didn't stand up from the kitchen table. He waited. The knock on the front door was Tonks. He'd expected an angry response from someone, and she was the fastest, most direct person in the order, and she'd had her writ since morning. He heard Uncle Vernon's explosive, scandalized response to a woman with bright turquoise hair at his front door, and then the louder, more resigned sound of Aunt Petunia's voice cutting across Vernon's, and then footsteps, and Tonks appeared in the kitchen doorway looking flushed and windswept and extremely annoyed. "Watcher, Harry," she said, which was her usual greeting and which she deployed now with a kind of defiant normalcy that he respected. "Tonks," he said. "Sit down if you want." She sat. She was in her aura robes, off-duty but still in the robes, which meant she'd come straight here from wherever she'd been when the writ arrived. She put it on the table between them, unfolded. "You want to tell me what this is about?" she said. "You've read it," Harry said. "You know what it's about." "I know what it says legally," she said. "I want to know what it's about personally." "From you. Not from a document." He looked at her and saw something he appreciated. She wasn't performing outrage. Tonks performed a lot of things, her whole metamorphmagus gift was a form of performance, but in moments that mattered she dropped it, and this was one of those moments. She was genuinely asking. So he told her. More plainly than he'd told the others, because Tonks was younger than the rest of the Order's core, close enough to his own generation to be spoken to without the careful management of elder feelings. He told her about 31 days of surveillance. He told her about Sirius, and what Sirius's death represented in terms of what happened when institutions protected their structures instead of their people. He told her about the vault and the ring and what the ring had made legally clear. She listened. She was good at listening, better than people gave her credit for, he thought, because her surface energy was so high that people assumed she wasn't attending. She was. When he finished she was quiet for a moment, turning her writ over on the table. "I was one of your watchers," she said. "The end of the street. I know you noticed." "I noticed," Harry said. "I thought," she stopped. "Started differently. I thought you were a kid who needed protecting and I was helping protect you." A pause. "Not that you weren't a kid. But that's the whole argument, isn't it? Whether protection without consent is still protection or whether it's something else." "Something else," Harry said. She exhaled. "Yeah." She picked up the writ and folded it again. "Okay. I get it. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't sting, because it does, but I get it." She looked at him steadily, and the turquoise hair shifted briefly to something darker and more thoughtful before she caught it. Is there a version of this where people can earn their way back in? Or is this permanent?" "It's permanent legally," Harry said. "But permanent doesn't mean I'll never speak to you again. It means when I do, it's because I chose it. Not because someone decided it was in my best interest." Tonks absorbed that. Then she said, "Right," and stood, and tucked the writ in her robe pocket, and looked at him with an expression that had dropped all the performance and was just honesty. "For what it's worth, and I know it probably isn't much right now, I think you're going to be incredible." She left before he could respond to that, which was probably intentional. Harry sat in the kitchen for a while after Tonks left, the late afternoon light coming through the muggle-clean windows, the house settling into its particular summer quiet. He heard Vernon come back down the stairs and make a theatrical detour around the kitchen, which was fine. He heard Dudley's television through the ceiling, the familiar bass of some action film. He pulled out Merlin's letter translation and read it again. Not the whole thing, just the last 3 lines. "Protect yourself first. Trust no one who has not earned it. Led not because you were chosen but because you choose." He'd been chosen, certainly. He'd been chosen by a prophecy, chosen by Voldemort's targeting, chosen by the Ministry's political needs, chosen by Dumbledore's strategy. He'd spent his whole life being the object of other people's choices. The ring was warm on his finger, steady and present as a second heartbeat. He was done being chosen. The evening brought Ron. Harry heard the crack of apparition from the back garden, imprecise, the kind of apparition that resulted from having just recently passed a test and being still slightly erratic with targeting, and then footsteps on the back patio and a knock on the kitchen door, even though Ron had been walking into the Burrows' kitchen without knocking since before he could legally apparate. Harry opened the door. Ron was taller than he'd been at the end of term, or maybe Harry just hadn't stood across from him in this context before, outside the castle's familiar scaling, out here in the normal world where Ron was simply very large and had hands the size of serving plates and was currently wearing an expression that Harry had seen before and always privately catalogued as Ron working something out. "Hey," Ron said. "Hey," Harry said. "Come in." Ron came in and stood in the kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the room rather than at Harry, which was how Ron dealt with things that were emotionally complex. He needed a moment to map the territory. Harry waited, leaning against the counter. "Mum cried," Ron said eventually. "Ginny mentioned. She never cries." Ron looked at Harry then. "She cried when Fred and George were expelled and she didn't even cry then, really. More like, a controlled situation." He stopped. "I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty." "I know," Harry said. Ron was quiet again for a moment. "Then, I got your letter. The bit about me needing to find a way to carry both things." He pulled a hand out of his pocket and rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a very Hermione way to phrase something." She influenced the draft. The corner of Ron's mouth moved. It didn't become a smile yet, but it moved. "Look," he said. I've been thinking about this since yesterday, and thinking is not, as you know, my strongest activity, so it's taken some time." He looked at Harry with the directness that was actually Ron's most underrated quality. When he was being honest, genuinely honest, he was completely without performance. "I think you're right. About the Order. About Dumbledore. I think Mum and Dad and all of them, I think they were doing what they thought was right and I think it was still wrong." A pause. "I think I was part of it, sometimes. The way I'd tell you to calm down, or I'd side with the, let's wait and see, position when you were frustrated. That was me prioritizing my comfort over your situation, and I'm sorry for it." Harry blinked. That was considerably more self-aware than he'd anticipated. "Hermione talked to you," he said. "For 3 hours," Ron confirmed. "By Flu. She was very thorough. She always is." "Yeah." Ron was quiet. "Then, I'm not going to choose between you and my family. I need you to know that's not a choice I'm making." "I'm not asking you to make it," Harry said. "The whole point is that it shouldn't be a binary." "Right." Ron nodded slowly. "Okay. Good." He looked at the ring then, for the first time since he'd come in, really looked at it, the way you looked at something when you'd been deliberately not looking at it because the implications were large. "Merlin's ring," he said. "Yes." "Actual Merlin." "Actual Merlin." "Yes." Ron stared at it for another moment. Then, "Bloody hell, Harry. I know. Like, genuinely the most powerful wizard who ever lived, Ron. And it was just there, in a vault, Ron." Harry looked at him steadily. "Are we good?" Ron came back from whatever historical amazement had briefly captured him and met Harry's eyes. Something passed between them that didn't need words, the particular wavelength of communication that only worked between people who'd been through things together that most people hadn't been through at all. Not resolution, exactly. More like continuation. The acknowledgement that something had shifted but the foundation under it was still the same. "Yeah," Ron said. "We're good." Harry nodded. "Good. Do you want tea?" "Please." They sat at the kitchen table while the kettle boiled, and Ron looked at the ring again and said, "Can I ask you something?" And Harry said yes, and Ron said, "Does Ginny know you like her?" "Because she's been in a foul mood since 5th year and I think it's related," and Harry said, "I kissed her this morning," and Ron's face did something complicated. "In the orchard," Harry added. "Of course in the orchard," Ron said. He picked up his tea. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She'll be insufferable about it." "She was already insufferable," Harry said. "It's one of the things I like about her." Ron drank his tea with the expression of someone absorbing multiple significant pieces of information simultaneously and doing better than expected. "Right," he said, at length. "All right. Are you?" "I'm fine," Ron said. "It's fine. You're my best mate and she's my sister and it's fine, and if you hurt her I'll do something, I don't know what, something unpleasant." "Noted," Harry said seriously. They drank their tea in the comfortable quiet of people who had been through enough together that silence was easy, and outside the kitchen window the summer evening was settling in, and the ward at the boundary was quiet, and the ring on Harry's finger was steady. Later, after Ron had gone home, more settled than he'd arrived, the particular steadiness that Ron achieved when he'd worked through something and reached a position he could stand on, Harry sat alone at the kitchen table with the last item in the leather case. A single envelope. He'd kept it separate from the others. He'd drafted it differently, worded it differently. Not a standard banishment writ, not the formal Accords language. It was addressed to Sirius Black. He held it for a while. The weight of it was disproportionate to the paper and wax, that particular emotional weight that had no physical component and everything personal. Sirius was dead. The writ would be filed with the estate, with the legal records, with the formal architecture of what Sirius had been in Harry's life. It would sever the guardianship legally, acknowledge the failure of it formally, and close a chapter that had been painfully open since the Department of Mysteries. He'd included something in Sirius's version that wasn't in any of the others. A paragraph in his own words, not legal language, that he'd written at 2 in the morning on the sleepless night when he'd made the final decision. "I'm not doing this because I'm angry at you. I think you were the most imperfectly perfect godfather anyone could have had. I'm doing this because the guardianship was supposed to protect me and it couldn't, not because you failed but because you were trapped in a system that didn't protect either of us, and that system needs to be formally acknowledged as insufficient. This is me saying it out loud, in the only language that changes things. I miss you. That's not going to stop." He sealed it. He pressed the ring to the wax. He put it in the leather case and closed the clasp. Tomorrow the case would go to Gringotts for the estate filing. Tonight it sat on the kitchen table, and Harry sat with it, and the house was quiet around him, and the ring was warm, and the grief that he'd been rationing in careful daily doses was here in the kitchen with him now, but it wasn't drowning him. It was just grief. The ordinary, permanent, livable kind. The kind you carried with you into the next thing because there was always a next thing, and the next thing needed you present. Harry got up. Washed his mug. Turned off the kitchen light. The ring cast a faint green shadow in the dark. He looked at it for a moment, then went upstairs. Tomorrow, Fudge would wake up and discover what had been filed in the Accords archive. Tomorrow the ministry would begin its reaction, and the political machinery would start turning, and there would be lawyers and Wisengamot procedures and people in important offices who were very unhappy. He was ready for tomorrow. He was, he realized, actually looking forward to it. He went to sleep. Chapter 4, The seat at the Wisengamot. The ministry owl arrived at 6:30 in the morning, before Harry had finished his first cup of tea. It was not the same kind of owl as Percy's plain parchment note, nor the official red ribbon correspondence he'd received 2 days ago. This was a large, imperious eagle owl with the golden burgundy ribbon of the Minister for Magic's personal office around its leg, and it carried itself with the particular self-importance of a bird that had been trained to expect people to make way for it. It tapped the kitchen window once, sharply, and waited with the expression of something that had never been kept waiting and saw no reason to start. Harry let it in. Untied the ribbon. Read the letter. It was 3 paragraphs from Cornelius Fudge, and the careful bureaucratic language couldn't entirely conceal what it was: panic dressed in a suit. Dear Mr. Potter, it has come to the Ministry's attention that certain documents purporting to invoke the Accords of Avalon have been filed with an entity claiming archival authority over said accords. The Ministry wishes to advise you that the legal status of the Accords of Avalon has not been formally recognized by the current Wiesengemot structure since 1823, and that any claims of authority derived therefrom are subject to review and challenge by the appropriate governing bodies. The Ministry further notes that the alleged existence of a founding seat designation within the Wiesengemot has not been independently verified and cannot be acted upon until such time as a formal hearing is convened to assess the claim's legitimacy. You are requested to refrain from taking any further action predicated on these claims until the Ministry has completed its assessment. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic. Harry read it twice. Then he put it on the table and drank his tea. The letter was precisely what Ragnarok had predicted, almost word for word, the Ministry's opening move, which was to challenge not the facts but the framework, because challenging the facts meant acknowledging they existed. The legal status has not been formally recognized since 1823 was particularly elegant, he thought. It said nothing about whether the accords were valid. It simply asserted that the Ministry hadn't been in the habit of recognizing them, as though institutional habit were a substitute for legal foundation. He wrote one sentence back on plain parchment: "The Accords of Avalon don't require your recognition, Minister. They predate your authority." He tied it to the eagle owl's leg and sent it back without waiting for his toast to finish. He was at Gringotts by 8. Ragnarok had the response ready. Harry suspected the goblin had had it ready for 2 days, anticipating the Ministry's move with the calm precision of someone who had watched human institutions perform this exact dance for several centuries. The bank's formal legal response to the Ministry challenge ran to 11 pages and had been prepared by Gringotts' legal department, which was, Ragnarok explained as he slid it across the table, the oldest continuously operating legal practice in Britain, predating the Inns of Court by 300 years. "We have also taken the liberty," Ragnarok said, with an expression that was technically neutral but carried a certain quality of satisfaction, "of notifying the Wiesengemot's clerk of records directly. The founding seat cannot be challenged through the Minister's office. The challenge, if it comes, must come on the floor of the chamber." "When's the next sitting?" Harry asked. 3 days. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. "I would recommend you be present." "I'll be present." Harry looked at the 11-page response and the stack of supporting documentation Ragnarok had assembled. "What's their best argument?" "The one I need to be ready for." Ragnarok folded his hands. "Their best argument is the 1823 Revision Act, which modernized the Wiesengemot's procedural framework and included a clause subordinating all pre-existing governance instruments to the revised structure. They will argue that this act effectively superseded the Accords." "And the counter?" "The Revision Act was passed by a body that had no legitimate authority to supersede the Accords, because the Accords are not a Wiesengemot instrument, they predate the Wiesengemot. You cannot vote to override a foundation by passing legislation built on top of it." Ragnarok's tone was the dry, precise tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand it. "It is as though a building's upper floors voted to declare the foundations non-binding." Harry almost smiled. "Who do I need on the floor with me?" "A sponsor, someone already holding a recognized Wiesengemot seat who can formally present you before the chamber convenes. Under the founding seat provision you do not need sponsorship for your seat itself, but procedurally, first appearances are sponsored." Harry thought for a moment. The order was banished. Dumbledore held the chief warlock position, but that was the last person Harry wanted as his formal sponsor. It would look like reconciliation, like Dumbledore vouching for Harry, which was the opposite of what this was supposed to demonstrate. He needed someone independent of both the Order and the Ministry's current loyalties. "Madame Longbottom," he said. "Augusta Longbottom." Ragnarok looked at him for a moment. "The Longbottom seat is ancient and noble. Augusta Longbottom is currently one of 3 independent bloc votes in the chamber who are aligned with neither the Ministry's faction nor the Dumbledore bloc. A pause. That is an intelligent choice. I know Neville, Harry said. His grandmother is, I've heard things about her. She's not someone who sponsors things she doesn't believe in. No, Ragnock agreed. She is not. Harry sent a letter to Neville that afternoon, not through Owl Post but through the bank's own courier service, faster and more secure, explaining what he needed and why. He told Neville the full situation, concisely, without softening it, the vault, the ring, the writs, the Wizengamot. He said, I'd understand if this puts you in an impossible position. But you're someone I trust, and I think your grandmother is someone who should know what's happening regardless of whether she agrees to sponsor me. Neville's reply came back within the hour. Gran says yes. She also says she's been waiting for someone to invoke the Accords for 30 years and she'd like to meet you before the hearing. She says to come to tea tomorrow. She also said, about time, which I think was about more than just the Accords. Neville. P.S. I think the ring thing is the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard and I'd like to hear all of it properly when you have a moment. Harry went to tea with Augusta Longbottom. The Longbottom estate was in Somerset, a substantial manor house that had the quality of old money that had survived intact by being too stubborn to diminish, the grounds well maintained with the kind of precision that reflected pride rather than wealth specifically. Augusta herself was exactly what her correspondence suggested, a small, upright woman of perhaps 70 with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone who had never in her adult life been in a room where she wasn't confident of her position. She was wearing her hat, the one with the stuffed vulture that Harry had heard about through Neville, which turned out to be real and which sat on her head with the same aggressive formality she brought to everything else. She looked at Harry the moment he arrived, looked at the ring, and said, "Sit down, Mr. Potter. We have a great deal to discuss and I prefer to cover it efficiently." He sat down. He liked her immediately. Neville was there, sitting slightly to his grandmother's left in the way people sat when they were near someone commanding and had decided to be comfortable with that rather than uncomfortable, easy in his posture, watching Harry with the open, grounded attentiveness that Harry had noticed about him more and more over the past year. Neville had grown into something in 5th year. Not just physically, though that too, it was more that the quality of his attention had sharpened. He was present in a way he hadn't always been, and it suited him. The tea was excellent and Augusta made no small talk whatsoever. "The 1823 Revision Act," she said, the moment she'd poured, "is Fudge's opening and it's weaker than he thinks. I've read it thoroughly. The subordination clause applies specifically to instruments of governance originating within the Wizengamot structure. The Accords of Avalon originate outside any Wizengamot structure. The argument fails on its own terms." "That's exactly what Ragnock said," Harry told her. "Ragnock is the most rigorous legal mind in Britain," Augusta said flatly. "He simply operates from premises that the Ministry prefers not to acknowledge. His analysis is correct." She looked at Harry over the rim of her teacup with eyes that were assessing him not unkindly. "You're not what I expected." "People keep saying that," Harry said. "People have been expecting a traumatized boy," she said, without apology. "You are clearly something else. That is not a criticism of anyone's expectations. It is an observation." "Thank you," Harry said. "I think." Her mouth moved in what was possibly a smile, briefly. "Tell me about the ring. Not the legal history, I know the legal history better than most. Tell me what it feels like." "Magically." It was not a question he'd expected, and because it wasn't expected it got a more honest answer than a prepared one would have been. He thought about it for a moment, the warmth, the clarity, the sense of a frequency finally coming in clean, and he described it like that, plainly, and Augusta listened with the focus of someone hearing a technical report. When he finished she set her teacup down. "What you're describing," she said, "is a magical alignment. The ring doesn't augment your power, it removes interference. Magical interference accrues over time, through spells cast on a person without their consent, through proximity to objects or individuals of specific magical polarity, through the accumulated weight of external magical influence. You have been the subject of an extraordinary quantity of external magical influence since birth. Her eyes were steady and not unkind. What you're feeling is your own magic, operating without impediment, possibly for the first time. Harry sat with that. Neville was looking at him with an expression that had gone quietly intense. The protections Bill Weasley mentioned, Harry said slowly. The Avalon wards. Passive reflection, legilimency resistance, compulsion immunity, Augusta said. Yes. Those aren't protections the ring grants you. Those are expressions of your own magical core, unimpeded. The ring simply provides the coherence for them to operate properly. She picked her teacup back up. You should know this because you will face, in that chamber in 3 days, at least 2 people who have historically relied on legilimency as a component of their management of a room. Harry understood immediately. Dumbledore, he said. Anne, Umbridge, Neville said quietly, from his grandmother's left. She's still on the Wisengamot. Educational decree authority lapsed with the end of term but her seat didn't. Dolores Umbridge, Augusta confirmed, has a minor departmental seat, which means she has voting rights on procedural matters but limited floor authority. However, she is very skilled at procedural matters and she will be Fudge's primary mechanism in the chamber. He will not speak much himself, he has learned that his own rhetoric is more of a liability than an asset in formal settings. Umbridge will do the formal work. Harry drank his tea. What do I need to do? In the chamber. Specifically. Present yourself. Declare the seat. Let Gringotts documentation do the foundational argument, Ragnarok's team will submit it to the clerk before the session opens. Your job is not to argue. Your job is to be unassailable. To walk into that chamber as though the question of your right to be there has never been a question. It hasn't, Harry said. Augusta looked at him. The smile came back, less briefly this time. No, she said. It hasn't. He spent the next 2 days in preparation that was less about information, he had the information, Ragnarok had ensured that, and more about the particular kind of mental preparation that combat required. He'd learned this in defense against the dark arts, in the room of requirement, in every situation where the stakes were high enough that arriving mentally half-present was the same as arriving unprepared. He walked. He thought. He reread Merlin's letter twice and the Accord's documentation once and the 11-page Gringotts response not at all, because he didn't need to know the legal argument in detail, he needed to know what mattered, and what mattered was simple, the seat was real, the ring was real, the writs were served, and no one in that chamber had the authority to change any of that, and he was going to walk in knowing it and let them spend their energy arguing against something that was already settled. On the morning of the hearing he dressed carefully. Not the robes he wore to Hogwarts, not anything from his wardrobe that had been purchased under Dursley's supervised grudging necessity. He'd sent Gringotts a request 3 days ago and they'd arranged it, dark robes in the deep green that the ring's stone echoed, cut properly, with the Merlin-Gryffindor crest on the clasp and a small detail at the collar that was both subtle and, if you knew what you were looking at, entirely clear. The seal of the seat. He looked at himself in the mirror. The mirror made a small, surprised sound and said nothing critical, which was its way of expressing approval. Neville met him at the Ministry's main entrance. He was there before Harry arrived, which Harry noted with appreciation. Neville understood the symbolism of positioning, of who was seen arriving with whom. He was in his own formal robes, the long-bottom crest visible, standing with the easy solidity of someone who belonged. Augusta had gone ahead separately, she had business in the chamber before the session and she'd told Harry she'd find her own way to the right moment with the confidence of someone who always had. Ready? Neville said. Yes, Harry said, without pause. They went in. The Ministry of Magic's atrium was busy with its usual mid-morning traffic, witches and wizards crossing toward the lifts, the golden fountain at the center doing its absurd water feature thing, various departmental owls crossing overhead. Several people noticed Harry the moment he stepped through the flue. He recognized the specific quality of the noticing, not just recognition, which was ordinary and constant, but something different. The ring caught the atrium light, and the Merlin-Gryffindor crest on his robes was visible to anyone who looked, and the people who looked and understood what they were looking at went still in the way of people confronting something they hadn't prepared for. He walked through the atrium without adjusting his pace. He heard someone say his name and didn't stop. He and Neville took the lift down to level 9 and the Wizengamot chamber and arrived as the pre-session activity was in full swing. The Wizengamot chamber was circular and tiered, roughly the same physical footprint as the Department of Mysteries courtroom where Harry had been tried the previous year, but with the weight of formal governance in its architecture rather than judicial intimidation. The purple-robed Wizengamot members occupied the curved seating of the upper tiers. The floor was for presenters. The Chief Warlock's chair was at the front, elevated slightly, and Dumbledore was in it, already seated, robes immaculate, expression utterly composed. He saw Harry the moment Harry entered. Something moved through Dumbledore's expression, quickly contained, not surprise, because Dumbledore did not do surprise, but the closest available thing to it. His eyes went to the ring. Then to the robes. Then to the crest. And something in his expression became very, very careful. Fudge was in the minister's observer seat to the right of the main floor, and he spotted Harry at approximately the same moment. His face went red in the specific way of a man encountering a problem he'd been hoping would resolve itself before it became concrete. Beside him, Dolores Umbridge, pink robes, the bow in her hair, the wide-toed eyes, looked at Harry with an expression that managed to combine professional assessment and personal animosity in roughly equal measure. Harry found Augusta Longbottom's seat in the upper tier, third row, independent block, and she met his eye and gave him a small nod that was precise and complete. The clerk of records, a harried-looking wizard in brown robes who was clearly having a more complicated morning than he'd anticipated, came up to Harry at the floor entrance with a clipboard. "Name and affiliation for the record," he said. "Harry James Potter," Harry said. "Lord of the seat of Merlin-Gryffindor, founding member, Wizengamot of Britain. Sponsored by Augusta Longbottom of the ancient and noble house of Longbottom." The clerk wrote it down, and Harry watched him stop writing, look at what he'd written, and then look at Harry. Then he looked at the ring. Then he finished writing, slowly, with the expression of someone taking care to be extremely accurate. "You'll need to present at the central floor position," the clerk said. "I know," Harry said. He walked to the center of the floor. The chamber's acoustics were extraordinary, every footstep was audible, and the room, which had been carrying the low-level murmur of 30-plus members settling in, went quiet in stages, like a wave running outward from where he stood. He stood still. He didn't fidget. He let them look. "This session is called to order," Dumbledore said, from the Chief Warlock's chair, in the measured, carrying tone he used for formal occasions. His eyes were on Harry as he spoke. "The first item before this body is a challenge to the validity of a founding seat designation registered with the Accords of Avalon Archive. The challenge has been submitted by the Office of the Minister for Magic." He paused. "Before the challenge is presented, I will note for the record that documentation supporting the founding seat claim has been submitted by Gringotts Bank's legal department and has been reviewed by the Clerk of Records overnight. The clerk's preliminary assessment will be read into the record at the appropriate time." Umbridge stood before Fudge had even opened his mouth, which told Harry she'd been waiting for the first available procedural moment with the practiced patience of a predator that understood timing. "Madam Undersecretary," Dumbledore acknowledged. "Thank you, Chief Warlock." Her voice was the one Harry recognized from 5th year, the deceptive sweetness of it, the little cough before each statement, the precision with which she used formal address as a weapon. "The Ministry wishes to draw this body's attention to the 1823 Revision Act, specifically Section 14, which clearly establishes this Wizengamot as the sole governing authority for all matters of, with respect," Harry said, and his voice carried clearly in the chamber's acoustics. "Section 14 applies to instruments of governance originating within the Wizengamot structure. The Accords of Avalon originated outside and prior to any Wizengamot structure. This has been documented in Gringotts' submission. He looked at Umbridge steadily. The argument doesn't apply. A beat of silence. Umbridge's smile thinned. Mr. Potter, she said, with the sugary patience she deployed when she was furious, it is customary in this chamber to wait for the floor to be offered before I hold a founding seat, Harry said. Under the Accords, founding seat holders have full floor rights at all times. The floor is always mine when I choose to use it. He kept his voice even, not aggressive, not performing, simply stating fact in the way that facts could be stated when you were entirely confident of them. If you'd like to cite the specific Accords provision that limits that, I'll wait. Umbridge did not cite a provision, because there wasn't one. Around the chamber the murmur had returned, different now, the textured murmur of a room recalibrating. Harry scanned the tiers without making it obvious. He could see the factional distribution the way a Quidditch player saw a pitch, Fudge's block in the upper right, Ministry loyalists whose votes went with the Minister reflexively, Dumbledore's unofficial alignment, which was the largest grouping but loosely organized, Augusta's independent block, 5 members, all watching Harry with expressions that ranged from sharp interest to open surprise, and scattered others who didn't fit cleanly into any camp. Fudge could not win this mathematically, Harry had worked that out with Ragnarok days ago. Even if every Ministry loyalist voted against him, he held 3 founding seat votes, 3 to each of the Ministry blocks won, and the independents were going to go with the more legally rigorous position because they always did. But this wasn't really about the vote. It was about what was established in this room today. The precedent. The fact of Harry standing on this floor and being unassailable. Let me be clear, Harry said, to the room rather than to Umbridge specifically, because the room was who mattered. I am not here to dismantle this institution. The Wizengamot has governed Wizarding Britain for centuries and it will continue to. What I am here to establish is that the legal foundations this institution rests upon include frameworks that have been dormant, not absent. The seat of Merlin-Gryffindor is real. Its registration is real. Its authority is real. These are not claims. They are facts, supported by documentation that your own clerk has reviewed and found preliminary sound. He paused. The Ministry may prefer that these facts not exist. They exist anyway. Dumbledore, from his elevated position, had not spoken since the opening. He was watching Harry with the full weight of his attention, not the managing, warm and measured attention Harry was used to, but something more direct, something that acknowledged what it was seeing without filtering it. Augusta Longbottom spoke from the 3rd tier. I would like to formally second the founding seat designation, she said, in the crisp voice that carried without effort. For the record. A ripple through the chamber. Noted, Dumbledore said. His voice was steady. Other seconds. 2 more hands went up from the independent block. One from a Wizengamot member Harry didn't recognize, older, who had been watching from the far left of the chamber with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Umbridge made 3 more attempts. She was skilled, he had to give her that. She was systematic, she knew her procedures, and she kept her voice in that register of sweet reasonableness that was designed to make opposition seem unreasonable by contrast. She tried the legal minor angle, he hadn't yet reached magical majority under current Ministry guidelines. He cited the Accord's emancipation provision. She tried the unverified bloodline angle. He offered the ring, and Ragnarok's genealogical documentation, and the bloodlock of the vault, and asked how many forms of verification she required. She tried, finally, a procedural challenge to the authenticity of the Gringotts submission, implying that a document produced by a non-ministry institution, Gringotts Bank, Harry said, has been the custodian of Wizarding Britain's financial and legal records since 1474. Their legal department has operated continuously for longer than the Ministry has existed. If this chamber is prepared to challenge the authenticity of Gringotts documentation, I'd encourage that challenge to happen openly and loudly, so that every witch and wizard in Britain who has assets in that bank can hear it. The silence that followed was the particular quality of a room in which a significant tactical error has just been made visible. Fudge's face had gone from red to a particular grayish color. Umbridge sat down. The clerk's preliminary assessment will now be read into the record, Dumbledore said, after a moment. The harried clerk in the brown robe stood and read in a voice that was trying very hard to be monotonous and professionally neutral and was not entirely succeeding because the content kept interfering with the attempt. The Gringotts documentation was found legally consistent. The bloodline claim was found verified. The Accord's registration was found valid. The founding seat designation was found, in the clerk's assessment, presumptively operative pending full Wisengamot vote. The vote was taken. 17-9. The seat of Merlin-Gryffindor was formally recognized. Harry stood at the center of the chamber floor and heard the vote called and felt nothing dramatic, no surge of triumph, no relief. Just the quiet satisfaction of a thing being properly done. He was 17-9 to the fact. That was all. That was enough. Members began moving after the vote, the chamber returning to the ambient business of itself, side conversations, papers shuffling, the procedural mechanics of governance resuming. Harry stayed at the center of the floor for a moment longer, because leaving immediately would have been a performance of its own kind, and then he turned and walked toward the exit. Dumbledore intercepted him. Not aggressively, he appeared at Harry's path with the unhurried quality of someone who had positioned himself in advance, and he said, very quietly, "Harry." A moment. Harry stopped. He looked at Dumbledore and waited. "I voted in favor," Dumbledore said. "I know," Harry said. "I saw. I want you to understand that he stopped. Started differently. I am not going to argue against what you've done. I have read the writs. I understand what they are. I understand, I have been taking some time to understand, what they mean about the way I have conducted myself." He held Harry's gaze. "I would like to say one thing." Harry waited. "Voldemort knows," Dumbledore said quietly. "About the ring. Not the details, but he will have felt the claim. A seat activation of that magnitude registers on the ambient magical field. He will be recalibrating his assessment of you." "Good," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "You have a plan for that." It wasn't quite a question. "I have the beginning of a plan," Harry said. "I'll have the rest of it shortly." He held Dumbledore's gaze for a moment. "Is that what you wanted to say?" "I wanted to say also," Dumbledore paused. "Be careful not to confuse independence with isolation. They are not the same thing." "I know," Harry said. "That's why Neville is standing 10 meters away and has been the whole time." Dumbledore turned briefly, and there was Neville, precisely where Harry had said, with the patient calm of someone who'd been waiting without making any performance of waiting. Something moved through Dumbledore's expression that Harry couldn't quite name. Then he stepped back and said, "I see," and Harry walked away. Neville fell into step beside him as they reached the lift. The doors closed. They stood in the lift as it moved, and the tension in Harry's shoulders, which he hadn't consciously noticed until now, released by degrees. 17-9, Neville said. 17-9, Harry confirmed. Gran voted first, Neville said, with quiet pride. Among the independents. I noticed. She said afterward. Neville paused. She said it was the first Wisengamot session in years she'd actually enjoyed. Harry looked at him. She has a very particular definition of enjoyment. She does, Neville agreed. It involves watching people who deserve to be wrong discover that they are. The lift opened and they stepped out into the atrium. Harry felt the eyes finding him as they crossed the space, more this time, more indifferent, not the usual celebrity recognition but something with more weight. People who'd been in the chamber, or who'd heard already from someone who had, the particular speed of institutional gossip where news moved faster than the people carrying it. He and Neville walked through it without adjusting pace. Outside, in the cool London air, Harry stopped and looked at the sky for a moment. A clear day, the city going about its enormous indifferent business around them. What now? Neville said. Harry turned the ring once on his finger. Now, he said, Voldemort recalibrates. Which means we need to move before he finishes recalibrating. Neville was quiet for a moment. Not the old quiet, the fifth-year quiet of someone trying to determine whether he was brave enough. This was steadier. You said you had the beginning of a plan. Yes. Does it involve me? Harry looked at him. It involves people I trust, he said. Which means yes, it involves you. If you're in. Neville looked back at him with those clear, grounded eyes, and said, I've been in since the Department of Mysteries. You just weren't watching closely enough to notice. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, I was watching. I noticed. He paused. I was just a bit occupied with other things. Fair, Neville said. They walked into the city, and behind them the Ministry of Magic hummed with the sound of an institution that had just been forced to confront something it had been quietly pretending wasn't there, and Harry didn't look back at it, because back was not the direction things were going. Chapter 5, What Voldemort Understood. The Owl found Harry at the Scottish estate. He'd moved there 4 days after the Wisengamot hearing, Avalon's Rest, as the property register named it, in the western highlands where the hills went vast and purple in the late afternoon and the loch below the estate's eastern face held the sky's reflection so perfectly that on still days you couldn't tell where water ended and air began. The house itself was old stone, long and low, built into the hillside in the way of buildings that had decided to be part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. The rooms were cold when Harry arrived and the fireplaces hadn't been lit in years, but the magic was intact. He could feel it in the walls, responsive and deep, the Avalon wards extending outward from the house across the grounds in a radius that Ragnarok had estimated at 1/2 mile. Nothing crossed that radius without Harry knowing. He'd spent the first day learning the house, walking every room, which took longer than expected because there were more rooms than the exterior suggested, the architecture not entirely subject to normal spatial constraints. He'd found a library on the second floor that contained books he'd never heard of and several he recognized from references in Merlin's translation, and he'd set those aside for Hermione, who was arriving in 2 days and who would, he was entirely confident, have opinions about every single one of them. He'd found something else on the second floor that stopped him in a doorway for a full minute. A study. Old desk, dark wood, a window facing the loch. On the desk, arranged with the deliberate care of something placed there by someone who knew they were placing it for someone else to find, were 3 items, a folded piece of parchment, a wand that wasn't his wand, longer, darker, with a grain that twisted slightly along its length, and a small mirror, round and framed in silver, its surface showing not a reflection but a deep, still darkness. He didn't touch any of them. Not that day. He wrote to Ragnarok instead, describing them, and the reply came back the next morning with the bank's characteristic precision. The wand is a secondary instrument, not a replacement for your primary wand but a reserve, specifically attuned to ancient magic. The mirror is a communication device of the old kind, more secure than any flow network. The parchment, based on your description, is likely a continuation of Merlin's correspondence. He left several such caches throughout his properties. Read it when you are ready. Ragnarok. He read the parchment that evening. It was shorter than the vault letter, less formal, written in the same translated Middle English that felt, stripped of its archaic dress, like a man talking rather than a man writing for posterity. If you found this room then you found the house, which means the ring found you properly and you are where you're supposed to be. By the time you read this, you will have done something that needed doing. I won't pretend I know what exactly, because the future is not as legible as people who have not attempted to read it believe. But you are here, which means something has been set right, and something is now going to push back against that rightness. It always does. This is important. The pushing back is not proof that you were wrong. It is proof that you were effective. The thing that opposes you now, whatever form it takes in your time, it will not come at you directly first. Direct confrontation with something that has claimed old power is not the first instinct of intelligent opposition. It will come at you sideways. Through what you love. Through what you haven't protected yet. Pay attention to the edges of things. You have more allies than you currently know. Some of them don't know it yet either. The second wand is for when you need more than one voice speaking at once. You will know when. Harry folded the parchment. He sat with the window's lock view for a while, in the last of the afternoon light, and turned the ring slowly on his finger. Pay attention to the edges of things. That was the morning the owl arrived. It came low over the lock in the early grey light, before Harry had finished his first cup of tea, and it wasn't an owl from anyone he recognized. It was a large black bird, almost raven dark, and it carried no ribbon and no crest. Just a plain envelope, sealed with wax that had been pressed with a serpent devouring its own tail, mirror image of the Gringotts dragon. Harry looked at it for a long moment. Then he opened it. The letter inside was written in a precise, cold hand, each letter formed with the deliberate exactness of someone for whom presentation was control. Mr. Potter, I write to you not as an enemy but as a peer. This is a distinction I have not previously seen reason to make, and I extend it now because circumstances have changed in ways that merit acknowledgement. The claim you have made is not a small one. The power you carry is not a pretended one. I am not a man who wastes time in denial of facts. The question between us has always been one of values rather than capability. I propose we discuss terms. TMR. Harry read it twice. Then he set it down on the kitchen table and looked at it with the specific quality of attention he gave things that were carefully constructed to produce a particular effect, the attention that asked not what does this say but what does this want me to feel. It wanted him to feel acknowledged. Peer to peer, one power to another, the letter of a man who had decided that the most effective approach was to make Harry feel seen and respected, which was the approach you used when brute force wasn't going to work. Voldemort was intelligent enough to know that the ring changed the calculation. Intelligent enough to try something different. He was also, Harry thought, intelligent enough to know that Harry knew all of this. Which made the letter interesting rather than alarming. Voldemort was smart enough to write knowing Harry would see through it, which meant the letter's purpose wasn't deception. Its purpose was to establish communication, to open a channel, to put Harry in the position of having to respond or not respond, to make the first contact and see what Harry did with it. Pay attention to the edges. He didn't write back. He filed the letter with Ragnarok for analysis and spent the rest of the morning doing something more immediately useful than worrying about Voldemort's correspondence. He walked the estate's boundaries and learned them. The Avalon wards, as Bill had described them and Augusta had clarified and Ragnarok had documented, extended passively from the ring in a constant radial field. On the estate's grounds they interacted with the older wards already embedded in the property, centuries of magical reinforcement layered into the stone and the soil, and the combination produced something that felt, when Harry focused on it with the particular ambient awareness the ring had opened in him, like a vast, complex, living thing. The estate knew him. Not in any mystical or sentimental way, just in the way that a place knows the person it was built for when that person finally arrives. The wards oriented toward him. The old magic of the house organized around his presence the way iron filings organized around a magnet. He spent an hour understanding it and another hour extending it deliberately, something else he discovered he could do instinctively, the way you discovered what your body could do when you stopped limiting it by what you'd been told to expect. Hermione arrived on the third day, exactly when she said she would, appearing at the estate's boundary in the late morning with a bag over her shoulder and an expression that cycled through wonder, academic excitement, and deliberate composure in about 3 seconds. The wards, she said, the moment she cleared the boundary. I felt them from the lane. What's their radius? Half a mile from the house, roughly, Harry said. Further in some directions. The eastern face extends to the lock. And they're passive? Continuously active without renewal. As far as I can tell. She looked at the house, then at the ring on his hand, and the academic excitement won comprehensively over the deliberate composure. Harry, she said, in the tone she used when she was trying to be professional about something she found extraordinary. This is, come inside, he said. I've made tea and there's a library upstairs that I think may permanently rearrange your relationship with magical history. Her face did something involuntary and delighted. She came inside. She spent the first hour in the library and said very little, which was either the deepest focus or the deepest pleasure, and with Hermione was often both simultaneously. Harry brought tea upstairs and left it and went back down to the kitchen and wrote several letters, one to Ragnarok with a request for more documentation on the Avalon Ward's offensive versus defensive characteristics, one to Neville asking when he could come to the estate, and one to Ginny that was shorter and more personal and which he was still writing when Hermione appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like she'd just spent an hour in conversation with someone she'd wanted to meet her whole life. The Foundation's text, she said, sitting down across from him with the slightly dazed quality of deep reading. In the library upstairs. I think it's an original copy. Merlin's copy, probably, Harry said. There are marginal notes. She looked at him. Harry. There are marginal notes. In Merlin's actual hand. In the margins of the most significant text in the history of magical theory. I know, Harry said. I found it on day one. I thought you'd want to see it. Want to see it, she repeated, as though the phrase was inadequate. Then she shook herself back to the present in the way she did when she decided that emotions could wait and there were practical matters. Right. Tell me everything. All of it that I don't know yet. He told her about Voldemort's letter. Her response was fast and precise, which was Hermione at her most useful. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, processed it, and then said, he's not proposing terms. He's testing your response. If you write back, you've accepted that he has the standing to initiate contact. If you don't write back, he learns how you respond to his opening moves and adjusts. She looked at Harry. What did you do? Sent it to Ragnarok for analysis. Didn't respond. She nodded. That's right. Third option, you acknowledge the letter exists without responding to it, which tells him you received it but aren't operating on his timeline. She turned her teacup in her hands. But he'll try something else now. The letter was a probe. When a probe doesn't produce the response you expected, you try a different vector. The edges, Harry said. She looked at him. What? Something Merlin wrote. Pay attention to the edges. He looked at the letter he'd been writing to Ginny, half finished on the table. He'll go after people. Specifically people I've recently been visible about choosing. The Wizengamot hearing was public. He knows Neville was there. He knows Augusta sponsored me. He'll have worked out from the Ritz who's been removed from my sphere and who hasn't, who's now less protected because they're less connected to me, and who's more exposed because they've moved closer. Hermione was very still. Ginny, she said. Ginny, Harry agreed. And Neville. And you. He looked up at her. Which is why I need everyone at the estate. And I need to be the one to reach out first, before he can. Hermione had her quill out before he'd finished the sentence. Neville arrived the next morning. He came with a letter from Augusta. She wasn't coming to the estate, she'd be more useful in London, in the Wizengamot, where she had eyes and ears that Harry didn't, but the letter was characteristically efficient. Voldemort has been active in the eastern counties. Not large movements, targeted. 3 families approached with offers in the last week. All 3 declined. All 3 have now reported unusual surveillance of their properties. He is mapping the landscape of your alliances. Move accordingly. Harry moved accordingly. He sent Ginny a portkey rather than a letter, a direct instruction, the kind he would previously have hedged with if you want and no pressure and the other qualifications of someone who wasn't sure of their own standing. He sent it as what it was, come to the estate. Now is good. Bring as little as possible, you won't need much. She arrived 2 hours later with a broomstick over her shoulder, a bag the size of a school rucksack, and the expression of someone who'd been waiting for an invitation that had taken too long to come. Nice house, she said, looking up at the old stone against the Highland sky. It's been empty for about a century, Harry said. It suits you, she said, and walked in. Ron came the day after, which Harry had also arranged, a port key, same phrasing, and Ron arrived with more luggage than Ginny, a joke that lasted exactly as long as it took Hermione to appear and ask him why he'd brought 3 jumpers to Scotland in July, and the answer was because it's Scotland, which was genuinely hard to argue with. They were settled by the 3rd day. Not comfortable yet, the house was still cold in the mornings and they were still learning each other's rhythms in this new configuration, without the castle structure to organize them, but present. Real. The 4 of them, plus Neville, filling rooms that had been empty for 100 years with the ordinary sounds of people living in a space. Harry spent the evenings reading. Not the Foundation's text, Hermione had effectively claimed that, but the secondary texts in the library, the ones that dealt less with magical theory and more with practical application. Ancient casting methods. Ley line interaction. The specific mechanics of what happened when old magic and modern magic met and which one yielded. The ring was changing him in ways he was still cataloging. Not dramatically, not suddenly, it was more like the slow shift of something finding its proper orientation, the gradual revelation of a range that had always been there but had been operating below its actual register. He could feel magic in the environment around him now in a way he hadn't before, not other people's spells, though he could feel those too, a gentle ambient awareness like knowing where every piece of furniture in a dark room is without having to touch anything. He could feel the ley lines that ran under the estate, 2 of them crossing beneath the house itself, which explained both the building's age and its choice of location. He could feel, on the 4th night, something cross the outer edge of his estate's wards. It was subtle. If he hadn't been awake, if he hadn't been sitting in the study with the 2nd wand in his hands, he'd been handling it, learning its weight and grain, the way it wanted to be held, he might have missed it. But he was awake and he didn't miss it. He crossed to the window. The lock was silver black in the moonlight, perfectly still. The hillside below the house was dark. He extended his awareness outward through the Avalon field, careful and slow, the way you'd extend your hand into dark water to feel what was there. Something was watching. Not a person, or not only a person. Something with a presence that was large and cold and deliberate, the same distinctive magical signature that Voldemort had carried at the graveyard in 4th year, pressing against the estate's outer boundary with the careful, assessing pressure of something testing a structure's limits rather than attacking them. Harry put down the secondary wand and picked up his own. Then, after a moment, he put his own wand down too. He walked out of the house. The Highland night was cold and vast and quietly magnificent in the way that the truly wild places were, the kind of magnificent that had nothing to do with human presence and continued independently of it. The stars were extraordinary, the Milky Way visible from horizon to horizon with the clarity that only came this far from city light. Harry walked down the hillside toward the lock's edge, below the house, between the 2 ley lines, and stood in the night air and waited. He knew Voldemort was watching. He knew Voldemort was present in some form, not physically, not in the flesh, the presence was too diffuse and deliberate for direct embodiment. A projection. A shadow sending, possibly, or a form of remote presence through a bound Death Eater acting as a magical proxy. Something that could observe without being vulnerable. That told him something. Voldemort was being careful. The ring had genuinely recalibrated his threat assessment. He wasn't engaging directly because he wasn't sure what direct engagement would cost. Harry stood at the lock's edge in the moonlight without his wand. He raised his right hand, slowly, the ring's green stone catching the moonlight and holding it, and he pushed his awareness outward through the Avalon field, outward and outward, past the boundaries of the estate, feeling the watching presence on the far side like a hand pressed flat against glass. Then he pushed back. Not an attack. Not defensive. Something else, the old magic's equivalent of making eye contact and holding it, the declaration that you have been seen by someone who is not afraid of what they see. He felt the moment of contact, the cold intelligence of Voldemort's presence meeting the deep, steady warmth of the seat's power, 2 distinct magical signatures pressing against each other in the dark, and what he felt from the other side was something he hadn't expected. Surprise. Quickly controlled, quickly contained, but genuine. The slight shock of encountering something that was more coherent than anticipated. Harry held the contact for 3 heartbeats. Then he withdrew, deliberately, not from retreat but from completion. He'd made his point, which was, I felt you. I let you feel me. This was on my terms. He stood at the lock's edge for another minute in the night air. Then he went back inside. The presence withdrew from the estate's boundary within the hour. He felt it go. He went to the kitchen, made tea, and was sitting at the table when Neville appeared in the doorway in his dressing gown, wand in hand, alert. I felt something through the wards, Neville said. Voldemort, Harry said. Or a proxy. Neville absorbed this. We're fine. He was assessing. Harry looked at his tea. Now he's reassessing. Neville came in and sat down. He was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of thoughtfulness that Harry had come to rely on, the kind that didn't need to fill silence with speech. Then, what does reassessing mean? For him. In practical terms. It means he won't send Death Eaters against the estate directly, Harry said. The wards make that costly and the Avalon field makes it more costly. Direct confrontation against this ground is an inefficient use of his resources. He turned his teacup in his hands. So he'll try something else. He'll go after something I care about that isn't inside this perimeter. Neville was quiet. The Wizengamot, Harry said. He'll go after the political structure I've just established. He doesn't need to break the seat, he can't break the seat, but he can make the political environment hostile enough that the seat's influence is practically diminished. He looked at Neville. Which means Fudge. Fudge has been compromised before, Neville said. He's going to be compromised worse, Harry said. Voldemort needs the Ministry weak and the Wizengamot divided. Fudge is the easiest lever. Probably already being pressed. He paused. But that's not the edge I'm most worried about. What is? The families Augusta mentioned. The ones who declined Voldemort's offers and are now under surveillance. Harry set his teacup down. He's not just watching them because they refused. He's watching them because some of them have recently, publicly, moved closer to me. Neville said nothing, but his expression had shifted into the focused, combat-ready quality that still surprised Harry slightly with its naturalness. 5th year had changed Neville irrevocably, and Harry was increasingly glad of it. I need to go to them, Harry said. Before he does. Not to put them under my banner or bring them inside any structure, just to make clear that they're not isolated. That there are people paying attention. When? Tomorrow. Harry looked at him. Come with me. Yes, Neville said, immediately. They went at dawn. The 3 families were spread across 3 counties, one in Suffolk, one in Devon, one in Yorkshire. Harry and Neville covered all 3 in a single morning by apparition, the efficiency of having 2 people who could both manage it cleanly. The first 2 were cautious, understandably. A Muggle-born witch in Suffolk whose property had been circled for 3 nights by what her neighbor described as very large birds moving in a pattern that wasn't natural. An elderly wizard in Devon who'd received visitors he didn't recognize asking questions about local magical boundaries. Both received the same thing from Harry, not promises, not protection pledges, not the offer of institutional allegiance. Just his presence, his contact details through the Gringotts secure courier, and the honest statement that they weren't unnoticed and weren't unvalued. The third was different. The family in Yorkshire, the Rowans, a family of 5, father and mother and 3 children under 10, were not under surveillance anymore when Harry and Neville arrived at 9:30 on a bright Yorkshire morning with the moors rolling golden green behind their stone farmhouse. They were under attack. Harry felt it from the lane, 2 distinct hostile magical signatures inside the farmhouse's boundary, and the particular sharp panic quality of protective magic straining. He was through the gate and across the yard and at the farmhouse door before his conscious mind had fully processed the transition, Neville a half-step behind him with his wand already drawn. He didn't knock. He pushed through the door with his hand flat against it and the Avalon wards preceding him like a bow wave, and the two Death Eaters inside the farmhouse kitchen, masks up, wands out, the larger one in the act of casting something at a woman backed against the far wall shielding two children behind her, had approximately half a second to register his presence before the Avalon field hit them. It was not subtle. The Avalon wards were passive under normal circumstances, ambient protective rather than aggressive. What they did when Harry moved through them with intent was something else, the old magic reading his purpose and amplifying it, the wards pressing outward with a force that wasn't a spell he'd cast but an expression of what he was. Both Death Eaters staggered. The larger one's ongoing curse simply stopped, the spell cut off mid-cast as though severed, the magic unable to complete under the field's influence. The woman, Mrs. Rowan, Harry assumed, looked at him with wide eyes over the heads of her children. "Take your children upstairs," Harry said, without looking at her. "Lock the door." She moved. The larger Death Eater recovered faster than the smaller one, big, broad-shouldered, the physical build of someone who relied on power rather than precision. He fired two curses in rapid sequence, both high power, both of the kind that left marks on walls and floors and people. Harry moved sideways out of the first one without thinking, the same nonverbal reflex of someone who had been dueling since fourth year, and the second he redirected, not blocked, redirected, a technique he hadn't known he knew until the ring had cleaned up his casting enough to make it available to him, the curse turning 90 degrees and impacting the stone floor between them rather than finding its target. "Do you know who I am?" Harry said. The Death Eater said nothing. Fired again. Harry caught it. Not with a shield, he simply caught it, the Avalon field absorbing it with the ease of something encountering a force considerably smaller than itself. The effort it took was roughly equivalent to catching a thrown ball. "Do you know what I'm carrying?" Harry said. He held up his right hand. The ring. The green stone in the morning light coming through the farmhouse windows. "Do you know whose ring this is?" The smaller Death Eater took 3 steps back. "Go back to whoever sent you," Harry said, his voice even. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them this family is under the protection of the seat of Merlin-Gryffindor and anyone who touches them will be touching me by extension." He looked at the larger Death Eater. "Tell them to think very carefully about whether that seems like a good idea." The smaller Death Eater disapparated. The larger one held his ground for another 2 seconds, Harry could see the calculation happening, the weighing of retreat against something else, and then he was gone too. Neville lowered his wand. The farmhouse kitchen was very quiet. A pot of something was still simmering on the stove, the mundane persistence of a morning meal interrupted by violence, and the steam rose and curled in the light coming through the window and the house smelled of hay and livestock and recently discharged magic. "You caught that curse," Neville said. "Yes," Harry said. "With your hand." "With the field." "Through my hand." Neville looked at where the curse had impacted the floor, a scorch mark, deep and clean. "Right," he said. "That's extraordinary." "I'll write it up for Ragnarok," Harry said. Mr. Rowan appeared in the kitchen doorway, older, 60s, the build of a man who'd done agricultural work his whole life. He looked at the scorch mark and then at Harry and then at the ring. "You're Potter," he said. "Yes." "They'll be back," the man said. Not a question. A man who understood how these things worked. "Probably," Harry said honestly. "Not to this house. Not while the seat's protection is on it, which it is now. I've keyed the estate wards to your property." He hadn't known he could do that until he did it, which was becoming a pattern. "That doesn't make you untouchable." "Nothing does. But it changes the calculation for anyone thinking of trying." The man absorbed this. Then he held out his hand. Harry shook it. They were back at Avalon's Rest by noon. Hermione was at the kitchen table with 4 open books and a quill that had been busy, and she looked up when they came in and read their faces and said, "Tell me." Harry told her. He told her about the Death Eaters and the redirected curse and the wards extending to cover the Rowan property and what he'd said as he left, and he told her what it meant in terms of the signal it sent. "You've drawn a line," she said, when he'd finished. Yes. And publicly. The Death Eaters will tell Voldemort exactly what you said. Which means he'll know the line's terms. She tapped her quill against her notepad. He won't test it directly. Not the same way. No, Harry said. He'll test it politically. Fudge. The Wizengamot. He'll try to erode the institutional legitimacy of the seat while he builds pressure on every other front. Then we need to be ahead of that. She looked at her open books. I've been reading the Foundation's text. There's a section, 7th chapter, that describes how the original seat holders managed political opposition. The precedents are actually quite specific. Tell me over lunch, Harry said. She told him over lunch, efficiently and comprehensively in the way that only Hermione could transform library research into actionable tactical information, and Harry listened and asked questions and Ginny listened from the other end of the table with her chin in her hand and the sharp look she got when she was filing things away, and Ron ate 3 sandwiches and said approximately 4 things, all of which were directly relevant, because Ron's gift was not volume but precision. After lunch Harry went to the study. He sat at Merlin's desk with both wands in front of him and the ring on his finger and the Foundation's text open to the 7th chapter, which Hermione had bookmarked. He read it slowly, following the arguments from foundational principle to practical application, and twice he stopped because something in the text connected to something he'd already done instinctively, and it was a strange feeling, reading the theoretical framework for something you'd already understood through practice. He picked up the second wand. He held it alongside his own, one in each hand, and thought about what Merlin had written, for when you need more than one voice speaking at once. He cast. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple lumos, split between both wands simultaneously, which should have been impossible. You couldn't cast from 2 wands at once, that was foundational, except that the ring was the connecting factor, the coherence that made the split possible, and both wands lit at the same moment with the same light and the light was clean and strong and a different quality than either wand alone. He held it for a moment. Then he extinguished both and sat quietly in the study with the lock visible through the window and the mountains behind it going dark in the late afternoon, and he thought about Voldemort's letter and the watching presence at the boundary and the Death Eaters in a farmhouse kitchen and the Wizengamot vote and Fudge's grey face. He thought about what Merlin had written in the vault letter. Many terrible things have been done by people who believed themselves to be helping. That applied to Dumbledore. It applied to the Order. But it also applied, in its own way, to Voldemort, not that Voldemort believed himself to be helping anyone, but that he had his own logic, his own framework that had calcified over decades into something that felt to him like coherence and to everyone else like madness. The difference was that Dumbledore's framework had room in it for adjustment. You could show Dumbledore evidence and the evidence would eventually land, even if slowly, even if grudgingly. Voldemort's framework didn't have that room. The letter, I write to you as a peer, was intelligent, even sophisticated, but it was the intelligence of a man who had been alone with his own thoughts for so long that he'd lost the habit of genuine curiosity about anyone else's. You couldn't negotiate with that. You could only position yourself correctly against it. Harry picked up the secondary wand and set it down again. He looked at the lock. Tomorrow he would write to Augusta about the Wizengamot strategy. He would have Hermione's research formalized into a document Ragnarok could work with. He would reach out to the 2 other families who'd declined Voldemort's offers and key them into the estate's extended ward network, which he was increasingly confident could cover more ground than Ragnarok had initially estimated. And he would write a second letter to the 3 families he'd visited, because the Rowan encounter had made something clear that hadn't been clear before. The protection of the seat wasn't going to mean anything if it only defended from a distance. Merlin had built his power, the real power, the lasting kind, by being present. By being the person who showed up. Harry Potter had spent 6 years being the person things happened to. He was the person who showed up now. He looked out at the lock as the last light left it, the water going from silver to dark, the mountains becoming silhouettes against a sky that was still faintly luminous in the west. Somewhere on the other side of something, Voldemort was reading a report about what had happened in a farmhouse kitchen in Yorkshire and recalibrating again. Harry could almost feel the calculation happening, the slow, cold, intelligent reassessment of an adversary who was, for the first time in this war, genuinely uncertain. Good, Harry thought. Stay uncertain. He went downstairs to dinner. Chapter 6. What Harry builds. The first frost came to Avalon's Rest in early August, which the Highlands considered entirely reasonable and everyone from further south considered a personal affront. Harry found it in the morning when he went outside with his tea, the grass crisp and white, the loch steaming faintly in the cold air, the mountains across the water standing in that particular sharp relief that only cold clear air produced. He stood on the stone steps in his jacket and drank his tea and watched the frost catch the early light and found, with some private amusement, that he didn't mind it at all. The house had warmed considerably in the 3 weeks since they'd arrived. Not just the fireplaces, though those were lit reliably now, Neville having discovered on day 2 that he had an unexpected gift for fire-tending charms that bordered on artistic, but in the lived-in sense, the way a space changed when people inhabited it with actual intention. Books had migrated from the upstairs library to the kitchen table and back. Ron had found a battered chess set in a downstairs cupboard and had systematically challenged everyone to games with results that were predictable for Hermione and Ron himself and considerably less predictable when he played Ginny, who had developed a tactical approach to chess that was essentially identical to her approach to Quidditch and was therefore deeply difficult to defend against. Neville had done something to the kitchen garden that involved 2 hours, a handful of seeds from his pack, and what Harry suspected was the most natural, unforced magic he'd ever watched anyone do. By the 3rd week the garden had produced tomatoes, which in August in the Scottish Highlands was either miraculous or evidence that Neville Longbottom had a more serious gift than anyone at Hogwarts had given him credit for. Harry had been working. Not in the anxious, reactive way of someone trying to stay ahead of threats, in the deliberate, building way of someone who had decided what they were constructing and was constructing it properly. Every morning he spent 2 hours with the Foundation's text and the practical application notes he was building from it. Every afternoon he worked with Ragnarok through the communication mirror, which he'd finally touched and activated on day 3 and which turned out to be entirely practical and considerably more secure than any other communication method currently in use in Wizarding Britain. Every evening he thought. Hermione had become, in these 3 weeks, the most useful person in the estate by a significant margin, which was saying something given that the estate contained 5 people all of whom were considerably more capable than their Hogwarts record suggested. She had worked through 2/3 of the Foundation's text and had produced a running analysis that ran to 40 pages and was dense with cross-references and historical parallels and occasional marginalia where she argued with Merlin directly, which Harry found privately entertaining and which he thought Merlin would have found, based on his letters, entirely appropriate. She had also identified, in the 7th and 8th chapters of the text, something that Harry had noted and filed but hadn't yet fully examined, a structural framework that Merlin had described as the architecture of chosen alliance, which was distinguishable from institutional alliance in specific and important ways. Institutional alliance is positional, she'd explained, the evening she'd finished her analysis of those chapters. You're allied with the role, not the person. It changes when the person changes. It's what the order is, people allied to Dumbledore's position, not to each other, which is why it fractures the moment the position is challenged. And chosen alliance? Harry had said. It's personal. Durable. Based on specific individual qualities that don't change with position. She'd looked at him over the top of her notes. It's also, according to Merlin, the only kind that holds under genuine pressure. Because institutional loyalty has a breaking point wherever the institution's interests diverge from your own. Personal loyalty, if it's genuine, doesn't have that breaking point. Harry had thought about that for a long time. He was still thinking about it, standing in the frosty morning with his tea, when he heard the door behind him. Ginny came out with her own tea and stood beside him on the steps, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked at the frost-white grounds and the smoking loch with the same unhurried attention she brought to things she found genuinely beautiful. She didn't say anything immediately and Harry didn't either, because one of the things about the past 3 weeks was that silence between them had become easy in a way that felt like something earned. Letter came in the night, she said, after a minute. He looked at her. Ragnar's courier owl. I heard it, you know I'm a light sleeper. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a sealed envelope. I left it for you. But I thought you should know before you went inside and found it with everyone watching. He took it. The Gringotts seal. He broke it and read. Mr. Potter, several items require your immediate attention. First, the Wizengamot has been petitioned by the Ministry for an emergency session regarding what Fudge's office is calling the Avalon constitutional crisis. The session is set for Thursday. Augusta Longbottom will be there. You should be there. Second, we have received intelligence through our own channels that Voldemort has made direct contact with 2 senior Wizengamot members from the Ministry block. The nature of the contact is coercive rather than persuasive. Third, Sirius Black's estate, specifically Grimmauld Place, is in a state of legal contest. With the severance of the guardianship writ, the estate's succession has triggered an automatic legal review. Several parties have filed claims. You have first claim under the terms of Sirius's original will, but it will need to be actively pursued. Ragnar. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it and looked at the lock. Complicated morning. Ginny said. Thursday in London, he said. Wizengamot emergency session. About you. Fudge is calling it the Avalon constitutional crisis, Harry said. Ginny was quiet for a moment. Then, he named it. He named it. That's actually helping you, she said. You know that. Once you name something you legitimize it. He's arguing about whether the accords are constitutionally valid, which means he's acknowledged that they exist and that they matter. She wrapped both hands around her teacup. He's losing the argument in how he's framing it. Harry looked at her. When did you get good at political strategy? I've always been good at it, she said. Nobody asked before. She met his eyes briefly, direct and clear. Tell them over breakfast. All of it. You'll want everyone's thinking. He told them over breakfast. Hermione's response was immediate and organized. She had a quill in her hand within 30 seconds and was making notes before Harry had finished, which was either her way of processing information or her way of not letting anxiety express itself as anxiety. He thought it was probably both. Ron's response was to finish his porridge first, with the characteristic Ron Weasley approach of feeding the body before engaging the problem, and then say, Fudge is frightened. Frightened people do stupid things in public. That's good for us and we should plan for it to get more stupid. Neville said, the 2 Wizengamot members Voldemort contacted, do we know who they are? Not yet, Harry said. Ragnar is working on it. Because if we know before Thursday, Neville said, with the quiet precision he'd been deploying more and more in these sessions, we can manage how they're positioned in the chamber. Seat them where they can't coordinate without it being obvious. Augusta can do that, she knows the procedural mechanics. Harry looked at him. Write to your grandmother. Today. Already planning to. Hermione set her quill down. The Grimmauld Place issue, she said, more quietly. The table's energy shifted slightly. That's the one you're most concerned about. Not a question. She knew him well enough to read the ordering of his silences. Sirius left it to me, Harry said. In his will. I didn't know that until Ragnar just told me. He paused. The writ I filed, the formal severance of the guardianship, it triggered a legal review because from the law's perspective I've formally closed the guardian relationship, which the estate succession was tied to. Someone has filed a competing claim, which means someone moved fast. Who? Ron said. Ragnar didn't say. I need to find out before I can deal with it properly. Harry looked at his tea. But I'm not losing that house. The table was quiet for a moment. He'd want you to have it, Neville said simply. Not dressed up, not elaborated on. Just the fact. I know, Harry said. That's not why I want it. He looked up. I want it because it's real. Because it's something Sirius actually chose to give me, and I'm done letting other people's legal maneuvering take things from me that were chosen. Nobody said anything else about it. They didn't need to. Harry spent the morning on correspondence, a long exchange with Ragnarok through the mirror about Thursday's strategy, a letter to Augusta that Neville read before it was sent and added 2 precise tactical suggestions to, both of which improved it considerably. A shorter communication to a handful of independent Wisengamot members whose positions Ragnarok had assessed as movable, not to lobby them directly, just to ensure they'd received copies of the Gringotts legal documentation and had had time to review it before the session. He was finishing the last of these when he felt the ward at the estate's boundary signal an approach. He felt it before the signal completed, a familiar signature, one he'd been half expecting for a week, the particular magical quality of someone he knew well. He went to the kitchen window and looked down the lane and after a moment saw the figure coming up on foot. Remus Lupin, in his worn robes, walking up the lane from the village with his hands in his pockets and his head slightly down in the way he walked when he was working through something as he went. Harry watched him reach the estate's boundary and stop. The Avalon wards would register him, not as hostile, because Remus wasn't hostile, but as carrying the residual signature of the banishment writ, which meant he'd feel the boundary as a perceptible resistance. Not a wall, not a barrier. Just a clarity. You are welcome here if welcomed. Harry opened the kitchen door and walked out onto the steps. Remus looked up. Their eyes met across the distance. Harry didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the man who had been his father's best friend, who had been the best teacher he'd ever had, who had failed him in specific ways Harry had already named precisely and filed and was not interested in relitigating, and he thought about Hermione's description of chosen alliance, personal, durable, based on specific individual qualities that don't change with position. You didn't write first, Harry said. I didn't think a letter was right for this, Remus said, from the boundary. Harry looked at him for another moment. Why now, he said. Specifically. Because I heard about Yorkshire, Remus said. What you did for the Rowan family. And then I sat with that for 3 days thinking about what it meant, and what I kept coming back to was, he stopped. Set his jaw briefly. You said, when you delivered the writ, that I understood you better than most and never fought hard enough for you. And you were right. I want to ask you directly, whether that's a fixable thing or a final one. The lane was quiet. Behind Harry the kitchen was warm and the smell of Neville's tea came through the open door and somewhere upstairs someone was moving around, the house making its ordinary occupied sounds. Come in, Harry said. Remus crossed the boundary. Harry felt the moment he crossed it, the ward acknowledging the passage and logging it, the same quiet awareness as every other entry. He walked up the path and Harry held the kitchen door. Tea. Harry said. Please, Remus said. They sat at the kitchen table and within 2 minutes Hermione had appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation with a single look, said, "Hello, Professor Lupin," in a tone that was cautious and warm in approximately equal measure, and retreated to the library. Ron came through a minute later, saw Remus, and performed the same careful calibration that Ron did when he was feeling his way through something with emotional complexity, which was to say hello normally and then become very interested in the cupboard where the biscuits were kept. Neville met Harry's eye from across the table with a look that asked "Are you good?" and received a brief nod in return. Harry poured tea. He waited until the kitchen had settled to just the two of them and said, "Tell me what's changed." Remus held his teacup in both hands. "My thinking," he said. "Specifically, I've been examining the habit of deferring to authority as a substitute for judgment, which is, a pause. Which is what I've done most of my adult life. It's easier, when you're the kind of person the world has never been entirely comfortable with, to align yourself with someone powerful and trust their judgment. Albus is brilliant. His judgment has generally been correct. But correct on the whole isn't the same as right in the specific, and I used one to excuse the other." He looked at Harry. "I used it to excuse not fighting harder for Sirius. I used it to excuse not fighting harder for you." Harry looked at him steadily. "The writ made it formal," Remus said. Which meant I couldn't do what I might have done before, quietly readjust, quietly reapproach, let the relationship find its level without anyone having to account for what happened. You made it so that accounting is necessary. And I think, he met Harry's eyes. I think that was the right thing to do. It was, Harry said simply. I'm not asking to be part of whatever you're building, Remus said. I understand if that's not, what are you good at? Harry said. Right now. Practically. Not what you were good at in 1993 when you were teaching. What are you good at now, with the skills you have and the knowledge you carry? Remus blinked. He hadn't expected the question in that form, which was the point. Defense, he said. Practical and theoretical, both. Dark creature identification and classification, I have more field knowledge there than anyone currently employed by the Ministry. Magical surveillance detection, order field work. And I can teach. He paused. I'm still one of the best teachers for defense that Hogwarts has seen. Good, Harry said. Because the people in this house need to be better than they currently are, and we don't have the time for a full Hogwarts curriculum, and you're the best person I know to close the gap. He looked at Remus. Not as part of the order. Not under anyone's authority but what we build here. On the understanding that your judgment is your own and mine is mine, and when they conflict we deal with it directly. Remus was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression was doing the same thing it had done in the Kentish town room, the grief and the respect, tangled, but there was something new in it now. Something that might have been, Harry thought, the look of a man who had been given back something he hadn't known he was still waiting to be given. Yes, Remus said. Agreed. Good, Harry said. You can start this afternoon if you want. After lunch Neville's been working on a counter-curse application that needs refining and I think you'll have thoughts. Remus looked at him. Just like that? What else would you need? Harry said. And the thing was, Remus didn't have an answer to that, because there wasn't one. That was the point of chosen alliance, Harry was coming to understand. It didn't require elaborate ceremony or formal process or the institutional machinery of managed inclusion. It required people deciding who they were to each other and acting accordingly. They had lunch. All 6 of them, the table fuller now, the conversation finding its level with the organic naturalness of people who were fundamentally compatible discovering it in practice. Remus was careful, initially, the particular carefulness of someone returning to a space they'd been absent from, and then gradually less so, because the table didn't leave room for sustained carefulness, Ron having no patience for it and Ginny having no social incentive to perform it and Neville being constitutionally incapable of making anyone uncomfortable without good reason. Thursday arrived between a practice session and a message from Augusta. The practice session had become a daily structure, 2 hours in the afternoon, Remus leading, working through the gap between what Hogwarts' defense against the dark arts had provided at its best and what was actually required for the things they were likely to face. The first session had been illuminating for everyone, including Remus, because what the students of 5th-year Hogwarts had developed in Dumbledore's army was technically good and practically somewhat limited in ways nobody had examined. Remus examined them, efficiently and without condescension, and set a direction. The message from Augusta came the evening before. The 2 compromised Wizengamot members are Tertius Avolt and Cassia Moorfield. Both Ministry block. Avolt's family has been threatened, livestock, property wards broken. Moorfield I believe is being offered something rather than threatened with something, which is more dangerous. I have positioned them apart in the chamber seating. I have also spoken with 6 independent members who will be present tomorrow. All 6 have read the Gringotts documentation. 4 of them, I believe, have already decided. The other 2 need to see you. A.L. Harry wrote back, I'll give them something to see. He arrived at the ministry the next morning with Neville again, and Hermione this time. She'd asked to come and he'd said yes immediately because Hermione in a room where legal argument was happening was a resource too significant to leave behind. She was in formal robes, her hair managed into something that communicated seriousness without trying too hard, carrying a notebook that she wouldn't need to open because she'd memorized everything in it. The chamber was fuller than the first session. Word had spread, the Avalon constitutional crisis, Fudge's own accidental advertising, had produced genuine public attention, and the public gallery above the chamber's upper tier was occupied for the first time Harry had ever seen in what was supposed to be a procedural hearing. Reporters. Representatives from the International Confederation. 3 members of the Goblin Liaison Office, which Harry suspected was Ragnarok's doing. Fudge was in his observer seat. He'd brought 3 ministry officials with him this time, which told Harry he knew the last hearing hadn't gone well enough. Umbridge was in her procedural seat. She looked at Harry as he entered with the expression of someone who had been thinking carefully about their approach and believed they'd found the right angle. Augusta was in her seat, 3rd row, independent block, utterly composed, wearing the vulture hat. Harry walked to the center of the floor. Dumbledore opened the session. His eyes found Harry immediately, as they always did, but the quality of the look had been changing across the weeks since the first session, less the managing look, more simply the look of someone paying close attention to something they found genuinely significant. This session has been convened at the request of the Minister for Magic, Dumbledore said, regarding the constitutional relationship between the Accords of Avalon and current Wizengamot governance structure. The chair recognizes the minister's representative. Umbridge stood. Thank you, Chief Warlock. The sweet smile. The slight cough. The ministry's position has been refined since the last session and I'd like to present it clearly. She turned to address the chamber rather than the floor, which was a shift. She was playing to the audience above as much as to the members. The ministry does not challenge the historical existence of the Accords of Avalon. What we challenge is the interpretation that those accords carry operative legal force in the current governance structure without explicit review and ratification by this body. She paused. The accords were written in a different era for a different society. Their application to contemporary magical governance requires this body's deliberate consideration, not unilateral activation by a single individual. It was better than her last attempt. Harry had expected this, had spent 2 evenings with Hermione working through exactly this framing and what it required in response. Madam Undersecretary, Harry said. She looked at him with the smile that was not a smile. Unilateral activation is not what occurred, he said. What occurred was a blood heir claiming an inheritance that has been waiting in a sealed vault for 953 years. That's not a unilateral action, it's a legal process with an extremely long queuing time. A pause. 2 people in the upper gallery laughed. But more to your substantive point, you're arguing that the accords require this body's ratification to be operative. I'd like to ask you to explain the mechanism by which a body derives the authority to ratify the instruments that its own authority derives from. A beat of silence. Because the Wizengamot's foundational authority, Harry continued, traces back to the Charter of 1267, which in turn references the Arthurian governance accords of the 9th century, which are themselves a derivative document of the Accords of Avalon. You're asking me to get the child's permission to inherit from the grandparent. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking you to cite the provision that makes that legally coherent. Umbridge's smile had gone very still. The Gringotts submission provides the complete governance genealogy, Harry said, to the chamber generally. Page 4. It traces every major Wizengamot authority document back to its foundational source, and every chain ends at the Accords. This isn't a matter of constitutional interpretation. It's a matter of constitutional fact. Augusta said, from the 3rd row, with the crisp clarity of someone making a formal declaration, I move that this chamber formally ratify the operative status of the Accords of Avalon in current governance, which would resolve the ministry's concern about unilateral activation while simultaneously establishing the clear legal foundation for the founding seat and its associated authority. It was elegant. Harry had known she'd find the elegant move. It was what Augusta did, the chess player's gift of seeing 3 steps past the obvious response. She was giving Fudge's ministry what they said they wanted, a formal ratification process, while making it a vote that would, if passed, cement everything Harry had already established more firmly than it currently was. Fudge's face did the grey thing again. The debate lasted 2 hours. Umbridge tried 4 more approaches, each progressively less effective than the last as the chamber's mood shifted. The 2 independents Harry needed, he could see them in the 3rd row, slightly apart from Augusta as she'd arranged, both of them listening with the focused quality of people making a decision, gradually moved. He could see it in the way they held themselves, the particular stilling of habitual fidgeting that came when a mind settled. Moorfield, the compromised member who was being offered something rather than threatened, was the one Harry watched most carefully. She was 50s, elegant, with the expression of someone who had spent years measuring the cost of everything before committing to it. She watched the debate with still, calculating eyes. Harry made the decision in the moment, which was not his usual approach but felt right. "Madam Moorfield," he said, directly, in a pause between formal exchanges. She looked at him. "Whatever you've been offered," he said, quietly, not quietly enough to be private in this room, but quietly enough to be direct, "it will cost you more than you've been told." "That's not a threat. It's the nature of how those offers work. You know this better than I do." The chamber was very quiet. "The independent seat you hold," Harry said, "has been independent for how long?" 31 years, she said, after a pause. "Then it's worth protecting," he said. "The Accords protect independent seats explicitly, Section 8, page 11 of the Gringotts submission. An active founding seat cannot compel or constrain independent seat authority. I have no interest in your vote beyond your honest judgment. Whatever else is being applied to it, you have my word it won't come from me." Something in Moorfield's expression shifted. Not dramatically, a small recalibration, a door that had been slightly closed opening fractionally. She voted for the ratification. A vote voted for the ratification. 17-7. The amended margin, the larger independent bloc swinging almost completely. The Accords of Avalon were formally ratified as operative instruments of British magical governance. The founding seat of Merlin-Gryffindor was formally established as a permanent Wisengamot position. Fudge left the chamber before the vote was called. Harry watched him go and thought, "That's what frightened looks like from the back." Afterward, Augusta found him in the corridor outside the chamber. "You spoke directly to Moorfield," she said. "That was a risk." "It worked," Harry said. "It worked this time," she said. "You have good instincts. Don't let good instincts replace good strategy. They're different tools." But her eyes were bright with something that was Augusta's version of satisfaction, which looked from the outside like strict professional assessment and was considerably warmer than it appeared. 17-7, she said. "Better than last time." "Because you seated Avolt and Moorfield where you could watch them," Harry said. "Your strategy, my instinct. They work together." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "They do." She adjusted the vulture hat. "Thursday next week there's a regular session. Energy prices, dragon restriction zones, the usual. You should attend. Boring business is still business, and being present for the boring parts establishes that the seed is operative, not theatrical." "I'll be there," Harry said. He found Hermione and Neville in the atrium, Hermione's notebook now open and covered in the dense marginalia of someone who had watched a 2-hour legal debate and had opinions about every 5-minute segment. She looked up when he approached. "Moorfield," she said. "That was you reading the room." "That was me and Augusta both," he said. "Yes, but you saw it in the moment and moved." She looked at him steadily. "That's something specific. The ability to find the pressure point mid-session and apply the right pressure at the right time." A pause. "You've always had it. Nobody let you use it." Harry thought about years of being told to stay in his seat, stay in the castle, stay at Privet Drive, stay put, and felt the ring warm on his hand in the way it did when something that had been limited was operating without limits. "I know," he said. Not bitterly. Just accurately. They went back to the estate. The evening they came back was when Sirius arrived. Not Sirius, not the real one, not the impossibility of that. It was a letter, and it was from the estate solicitor handling Sirius's will, and it was simple: the competing claims to Grimmauld Place had been reviewed and dismissed. As Sirius's named heir, with Gringotts confirming the succession validity through the seat's legal standing, the property was Harry's. Transfer effective immediately. He read the letter sitting at the kitchen table while everyone moved around him with the ordinary evening sounds of dinner being assembled, and he read it twice and set it down and sat quietly for a moment. Ginny appeared next to him and sat in the chair that had become, through 3 weeks of daily use, functionally her chair. She looked at him. She didn't ask. "Grimmauld Place," he said. "It's mine." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" He thought about that house, the dark, narrow, oppressive Order headquarters, the place where Sirius had been a prisoner in his own home, where Harry had spent a miserable summer between years 4 and 5, where the Black family's history sat in every portrait and every piece of furniture like something that hadn't been aired out in generations. "Change it," he said. "Not immediately. But eventually. It's a townhouse in London with rooms that could be useful, and I'm not going to let it keep being what it was." He looked at the letter. "Sirius wanted me to have it. I'm going to be worth having it." She put her hand over his on the table, briefly, and then went back to whatever she'd been doing, because Ginny's affection was like that, present and real and then gone back to motion, which suited Harry in a way he was still discovering. After dinner Remus ran a session with Hermione and Neville on a specific counterjinx application, and Harry sat in the kitchen with Ron and played chess, which he lost in 11 moves with no real surprise. "You're getting better," Ron said, beginning to reset. "I'm really not," Harry said. "You're getting better at recognizing when you've lost earlier than before. That's a strange definition of improvement." "It's the only definition that applies to you currently," Ron said, with the perfectly level delivery he used when he was being funny in the direction of honesty. He set the black pieces back. "Can I say something?" "When have you ever asked before saying something?" Ron looked at him. "The thing with the Order," he said. He moved a pawn, the opening of a game they both knew would be short. "I've been thinking about whether I handled it right. My response. Whether I did the right thing." Harry moved his own pawn. "What do you think?" "I think I was slow," Ron said. "I think it took me too long to get to the right place. And I've been wondering if you noticed." "I noticed," Harry said. "I also knew you'd get there. That's the difference between slow and wrong." Ron looked at the board for a moment. "Your mum," he said, with a slight shift in the word that made it tentative. "Not my mum. Lily." "Do you?" He stopped. "Sorry. That's a weird thing to bring up." "No, it's not," Harry said. "What?" "I was thinking, there's a mirror in the East Wing. Second room. I don't know if you've been in there." Harry frowned. "I haven't been in every room yet." "It shows people," Ron said. "Not reflection people. People." He looked uncomfortable. "I thought I saw someone in it yesterday and I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure if I was imagining it and I didn't want to, I don't know." "Make it weird." Harry set his chess piece down. He went to the East Wing that night, alone, after everyone had gone to bed. The second room was a small sitting room, cold and dark until he lit the fireplace, with 2 chairs and a bookcase and a mirror on the west-facing wall. The mirror was tall and oval, framed in silver that had gone dark with age, with a quality to its surface that was different from the communication mirror in the study. This was reflective, genuinely reflective, but there was something behind the reflection. He stood in front of it. For a moment there was just himself, the ring, the dark robes, the face he'd seen in mirrors his whole life and always found slightly startling for how much of his father was in it. Then the reflection deepened, the way a pool deepened when you looked past the surface into what was below, and there were 2 other figures. A man with messy dark hair and glasses. A woman with red hair and green eyes. Harry stood very still. The figures were not doing anything dramatic. They were simply there, present in the way of people who were occupying a space, and they were looking at him the way parents looked at a child they were proud of and didn't have the words for. His father had his hands in his pockets, which was a gesture Harry had seen in dozens of photographs and always found privately comforting for how much it matched his own. His mother's expression was, he didn't have a word for it, actually. It was too specific to be summarized. It was her. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He didn't speak to them. He didn't know if they could hear him, didn't know the mechanics of what this was, whether it was a communication device or a memory echo or something else entirely. But he stood there and looked, and they looked back, and the fireplace crackled behind him, and the ring was steady and warm on his finger, and something that had been a particular kind of cold in his chest for a very long time was less cold in this room. After a while he said, simply, I've got it from here. Not because he was sure they could hear him. Because it was true and it needed to be said out loud. His father's reflection put one hand briefly flat against the mirror's interior surface. Not reaching through, just present. Acknowledged. Harry pressed his own hand against the glass. Then he turned and went back to bed. In the morning the frost had lifted and the lock was flat and brilliant in the early light, and Harry stood on the steps with his tea and watched the mountains come clear in the Highland morning, and he thought about the letter from Merlin, I leave you not power but clarity, and he thought about 17 votes in a chamber and Remus in a kitchen chair and Ginny's hand briefly over his and Ron losing at his own game with perfect grace and Neville's tomatoes in August and Hermione arguing with a dead wizard in the margins of a 1,000-year-old book. He thought about what he was building. Not the Order had been Dumbledore's, assembled around a mission and a leader, cohering around a central authority and fracturing when that authority was challenged. Not the Ministry was an institution, which meant its first loyalty was to itself. Something else. Something that the 7th chapter of the Foundation's text had described and Hermione had analyzed and he had, over the past 3 weeks, been living. People who had chosen each other. Specifically. For specific reasons. In full knowledge of each other's failures and capacities and genuine particular qualities. Not because they occupied the right positions or served the right mission or were loyal to the right leader, but because they had looked at each other clearly and decided yes, this person, this specifically. Remus, who was learning to use his own judgment. Neville, who had always had it. Hermione, who was brilliant and honest and chose him over institutional comfort and would argue with him when she was right, which was often enough to be necessary. Ron, who was slow to arrive and then fully present, and whose precision was the more valuable for being rare. Ginny, who had never once managed him. And Augusta Longbottom, who was not inside the estate but was a presence in its orbit, the ally who didn't need to be close to be powerful, who operated from her own base with her own authority and chose to move in the same direction because the direction was right. And Ragnarok, who had waited 953 years and was not, Harry was increasingly convinced, doing this entirely out of professional obligation. This was what he was building. And it had no name yet and required none. Named things attracted institutional attention, attracted the instinct to formalize and therefore to manage and therefore to take over. It was simply people, with clarity, with chosen loyalty, with full use of what they were individually good at. Voldemort was still out there. The war was still happening. 3 days ago Ragnarok had forwarded intelligence about Death Eater movements in the Midlands and Harry had spent an afternoon with Augusta and the Secure Mirror working through the implications, and there would be more afternoons like that, more sessions with Remus, more Wisengamot business, more moments where the opposition pushed and he pushed back. He was not done. He was, in some ways, just starting. But he was starting from here, from this house, this frost-cleared morning, this ring that had been waiting for him for almost 1,000 years. From the decision, made in a bedroom at Privet Drive above a water stain he'd memorized, that being chosen was not the same as choosing and that the difference was the whole thing. The door behind him opened and Neville appeared with his own tea and stood a few steps down, looking at the lock with the quiet contentment of someone who genuinely liked mornings. "Good day today," he said, not as a question about the future but as an opening, The way you said let's go without saying the words. Good day, Harry confirmed. Behind them, through the kitchen window, Hermione's voice and Ron's voice were doing the specific overlapping rhythm of an argument about something that would resolve in 10 minutes into a plan, and the fire in the kitchen hearth threw warm light through the glass, and somewhere upstairs Ginny was probably already awake and doing something with the efficient energy she brought to mornings. And Remus was in the east wing, Harry thought. He'd seen the light under the door. He suspected Remus had found the mirror. He was going to let him have the time with it. Some things didn't need managing. He drank his tea and the mountains were perfectly clear across the loch and the ring was warm on his hand, exactly where it had always been meant to be.